That's our cue, literally our cue.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Zoe Lee. I'm an attorney advisor here in the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau's Cybersecurity and Communications Reliability Division. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the FCC's Cybersecurity Workshop for Telecommunications Providers. For everyone's awareness in the room, there are printed agendas with participant bios available on the table by the entry. And we also wanted to remind everyone that today's event is being live streamed and a copy of the recording will be uploaded to the FCC's website after today. We have 3 great presentations planned for today, starting with a presentation on cybersecurity risks to telecommunications networks. Then we'll have a panel on best practices for cybersecurity risk management. And we'll close with a presentation on how to prepare for and respond to a cyber attack. But first, I'm pleased to introduce Austin Randazzo, Deputy Bureau Chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, who will offer some opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone. Great to see so many folks here today. Welcome to the FCC's workshop on the topic of cybersecurity for telecommunications carriers. Telecommunications service providers are a core part of the critical infrastructure that we all rely on every day. This makes communication infrastructure a prized target for both foreign adversaries and cyber criminals. Among the many things that we do in the FCC's Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau is collaborate with stakeholders to help strengthen communication sector resilience, including resilience to cyber attacks. For example, in January of this year, our Bureau released a public notice that urged communications providers to implement cybersecurity best practices to protect their networks from malware, and we shared best practices for defending against ransomware attacks. When cyber attacks against telecommunications carriers are successful, they result in real-world consequences that can disrupt critical communication services. For example, an attack could diminish or disrupt the voice, text, and data communications for our carrier subscribers. And that means people cannot call friends or family or operate their businesses. Attacks can severely affect 911 or cut the public off from it completely, putting them in danger by preventing them from seeking help during life-threatening emergencies. Cyber attacks can even disrupt the communications of first responders and national security personnel, making it harder for them to do their jobs to protect the public. Aside from the very real and severe impacts that a cyber attack can have on telecommunication providers' operations, an attack can also compromise subscribers' sensitive personal information, their location, or confidential business information. The financial and reputational costs of a successful cyber attack can be staggering. In the face of these growing threats, service providers must be able to effectively prevent, detect, respond to, and recover from cybersecurity incidents. This might seem like a tall order for small providers that aren't sure how to get started, but don't worry, the FCC is here to help. Today's workshop is a collaborative effort between telecommunications carriers, federal government stakeholders, and other cybersecurity practitioners and experts to increase awareness of the emerging threat landscape and share practical approaches to protect networks and the public. Over the next 3 sessions, you'll hear more about these risks to communications infrastructure, and also have an opportunity to learn from leading experts who will share best practices to protect against these threats and provide guidance that you can begin implementing right away. Our goal today is to demystify cybersecurity for you so that service providers of all sizes can take immediate action to reduce the risk to their networks. For those of you who are technically savvy and know all about these risks, we hope we'll equip you today with some ways to communicate to your organization's executives or your fellow board members about the importance of taking protective action now so that you'll be better prepared to successfully respond on what might otherwise be the worst day that your organization could have. To start us off, please allow me to introduce Dr. Charles Clancy, MITRE's Chief Technology Officer and Senior Vice President for Technology and Engineering. In this role, he leads delivery of technical capabilities and solutions to the 6 federally funded research and development centers MITRE operates on behalf of the U.S. government. He'll be talking to you today about the current threat environment facing telecommunications providers, including the threats posed by nation-state actors and ransomware. Dr. Clancy, the floor is yours.
Excellent, thank you. It's great to be with all of you this morning. and a topic that I think is increasingly existential to much of our national infrastructure. I think back to 2018 when Dan Coates testified as part of the annual Worldwide Threat Assessment to Congress with his sort of famous quote about the lights are blinking red. Was kind of a big wake-up call, I think, as we observed significant increase in threats to critical infrastructure, with telecommunications being a key target. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about how that threat has evolved since the sort of the inflection point of the blinking red comment, and really kind of what we see today, and in particular, we've got obviously major criminal groups that are actively exploiting our infrastructure, in addition to growing nation-state threats that are increasingly serious, particularly as we look at sort of overall geopolitical tensions and what the risks could be to our infrastructure, depending on how all that plays out. So let me get started. Let's see, I've got my slide clicker. Okay. So a few things I want to talk about today. So really, what is threatening the sort of telco infrastructure today? Again, I'm going to focus on the small to medium-sized telcos. I'd say the larger telcos obviously face large threats as well. But what I want to do today is really zero in on some of the things that the larger group of smaller carriers can try and work on, because again, they're also sort of equally critical to the larger fabric of our infrastructure. Talk through sort of what the ramifications of some of these threats could be, and then really what the industry should emphasize. The panel that comes after me is going to really kind of go into the best practices, so I'm not going to dwell too much on that. I'll just steal all your thunder and then hand it over to you to to elaborate on, but a few ideas there as we kind of get to the end of the presentation. Okay. There we go. I have a separate thing here that I'm looking at, and then it's not that, and so anyway. So one of the first things I want to emphasize is that telecom is both a target for adversaries that are specifically looking to target and exploit telecom, because telecom is telecom. But it's also an attack path, right? The internet is the vector through which cyber threats convey. And so in particular, if you're looking at both nation-state and criminal threat actors, the internet is their highway. And so telecom has kind of this dual role in, and perhaps sort of dual exposure, if you will, in the impact and interest that adversaries have in it. Some key points I would say, as a bottom line up front right here. First is that I'd say criminal actors are the most likely near-term disruptors. And it depends on kind of how you quantify the threats. So nation-state threats are certainly significant, but I would say in the immediate term, they're less likely to be disruptive. If you look at the behavior that they've taken, a lot of it is getting into the system and burrowing in for strategic advantage in the future, perhaps espionage. But if you're looking specifically at disruption, then it's the criminal groups that are the ones threatening to be disruptive and destructive as part of ransomware or extortion or distributed denial-of-service attacks. So in terms of service interruptions, right, it's in the immediate term, it's criminal. If you play the tape forward, say 3 to 5 years, there is significant risk of nation-state adversaries pivoting to disruptive attacks. We're already seeing Russia and China begin to experiment with disruptive attacks against critical infrastructure and telecommunications in particular. And that represents, particularly if there is an escalation in geopolitical tensions with China, a significant risk to our infrastructure. Just to kind of put that into context, I'll get into more detail later. I think it was last year's intelligence community worldwide threat assessment that kind of went into detail that if China enters into a conflict with Taiwan, they will seek to deter U.S. intervention by destructive attacks against U.S. critical infrastructure. So this is, I'd say, a clear and present danger that we need to be thinking through. And I'd argue that much of our critical infrastructure defense that was put in place by Executive Order 13636, now 11 years ago, 12 years ago, is designed for non-destructive and episodic nation-state threats. And the threat that we could face in a couple years from a nation-state adversary is persistent, not episodic, and is destructive, not purely to establish presence and to steal information. And that change, I think, means that we need to deal with and manage those threats differently. And so part of my message later on is going to be that we need to exercise differently, we need to prepare differently, and a lot of that needs to happen now because, again, if we're looking at a 2027, 2028 timeline, which is what a lot of people are talking about for Chinese readiness to invade Taiwan, and that is potentially the timeline that we could be facing some of these larger destructive attacks against our critical infrastructure. I don't think there's some magical technical solution that's going to make everything secure. I don't know, maybe AI is going to figure it all out in the next 2 years, but probably not. And so a lot of the work that needs to be done is really cross-sector coordination, COOP planning, making sure that when the internet breaks, local infrastructure providers know who to call and know how to coordinate in response. So I think I've said a few of these things already. In terms of the blocking and tackling, what we can do now for both classes of threats, they're not all that exciting. They're I say boring but decisive. It says here on the slides. Edge devices are probably the biggest threat vector right now. China has a significant reverse engineering effort underway to exploit edge devices. Much of this was born out of the zero trust policy coming out of the United States. We began pushing everyone to zero trust. Zero trust now kind of has these edge access gateways that intermediate a lot of the security relationships. They then become the sort of single target for exploitation. And so we've seen Palo devices, Cisco devices, Avanti devices, Fortinet devices, all of them have had a whole range of zero-day vulnerabilities that have popped up in the last couple of years, really all as a result of a concerted effort by the PRC to reverse engineer and develop and exploit those as sort of novel single points of failure in our infrastructure. Certainly identity, backup, logging, I mean, these are all things that are necessary for being able to defend, particularly against ransomware attacks. They're critical to incident response, forensics, being able to do attribution, all the stuff that happens as you're dealing with some of these incidents. For small and medium telcos, not just data loss, but service continuity is an important aspect to all of this. If you think about the Colonial Pipeline attack a few years ago, that was exclusively against the management networks of the it was the IT infrastructure that had nothing to do with the pipeline itself, but it created a service disruption because there was so much concern over whether or not there had been access to the OT infrastructure. And so even if not targeting the control plane, the management plane, the actual service delivery infrastructure, attacks against billing systems and others end up creating exposure for service discontinuities. And also small and medium telcos have sort of this important role in everything from emergency communication routing, PSAP connectivity, trusted interconnects, things like BGP, all are points where they can be, targeting them allows an amplification of that attack across the sort of the broader infrastructure. And like I said, it's not just about prevention at this point. I think if you've got nation-state actors coming at you with 0 days, there's a certain amount of prevention that you can do, but now it's how quickly can you respond and recover. And so isolation, recovery, and practicing that is really one of the big messages I want to get across this morning. Okay. And I've probably said a few of these things already. One, I just want to highlight that the small and medium-sized carriers are mission critical. So you've got rural connectivity. You've got a lot of, and not just for for homes and residences and citizens, but also a lot of regional enterprise infrastructure as well is flowing through a lot of the smaller carriers. Public safety interconnects is another really important part of this. Particularly as you look at our 911 response infrastructure, the PSAP infrastructure. All of this is dependent not only on the larger carriers, but also many of the medium and smalls as well. There's a thin margin for downtime. So as I mentioned before, even if you go after ransomware events after billing or customer service infrastructure, right, is going to potentially cause a service disruption, even if it's not targeting, the control plane or the management plane of these systems. Harder to defend alone. So we've got smaller security teams. I was testifying at a House Homeland Security hearing a couple years ago about cybersecurity in the water sector, and one of the witnesses was talking about their experience trying to manage the cybersecurity for a water pumping facility in the Midwest, and this guy's a farmer, and 10% of his time is running the town's pumping system. So it's not as though there's a whole CISO team that's there to help defend that infrastructure against exploitation. And there's something on the order of 40,000 of these very localized pieces of infrastructure that are locally managed. And again, that's sort of an extreme case. But in general, the small to medium-sized carriers are not resourced the same way to have the same scale of cybersecurity and defensive infrastructure that the largers do. And again, high trust relationships, right? If you are peering BGP with your neighbors, your ability to broadcast, or an adversary's ability to cause you to broadcast faulty BGP routes is going to be just as effective if they're doing this from an exploited router in a smaller, medium-sized carrier as a major core internet router. BGP is BGP, and it's sort of all equal, if you will. It doesn't matter if you're a big guy or a small guy. And so, again, this represents vulnerabilities in perhaps some of the less defended infrastructure create risks for the entire sector. So I just want to highlight a couple different threat actors. Certainly there's the potential to dispute exactly where all these boxes are on the chart, and perhaps a healthy debate about what you think is higher consequence and what you think is higher likelihood. But I'd say broadly, you have a few things I want to highlight. One is at the bottom, this credential market. So one of the shifts that we're seeing in the ecosystem is the threat actors are not independently gaining credentials to access your systems. They're often relying on third-party brokers. So there's this whole layer of credential markets where adversaries are seeking to exploit and identify login information, preferably privileged login information, and then selling that access to third parties, right? So the ransomware groups are able to leverage these credential markets to gain initial access. They don't have to do it all themselves. There's this sort of stratified economy of criminal threat actors that are each acting at sort of different layers of the threat of the kill chain. So the people that are doing the reconnaissance and maybe the initial phishing in order to gain access to usernames and passwords are not the same people that are then getting in and establishing initial access, and maybe not the same people because of some franchising scheme that the ransomware groups have that might be actually extorting you and holding you for ransom, which then is maybe a whole nother actor that's responsible for the cryptocurrency money laundering and moving the money on the back end. So sort of each step in the kill chain could be different people in this larger kind of complex criminal ecosystem that is seeking to exploit you. So we're really seeing this professionalization, if you will, of the criminal ecosystems, organized crime by definition, and that, again, just creates greater risks because it means that those threat actors are more sophisticated with more resources at their disposal in order to exploit their targets. Plenty of other threats on here as well. Certainly the insider threat remains a big concern. there's, I'd say, less likelihood, but can have devastating consequences on the organization if you've got an insider. I know a lot of organizations have looked at how they stand up insider threat programs. How do you detect when you've got potentially someone who may seek to use their insider access negatively? Certainly, there's been some high-profile cases of that in the last decade that really, I think, have inspired folks to want to figure out how to manage that. And then, of course, error is often a source as well. The number of times the telecom infrastructure goes down, right? I think the answer, the quip on that is it's always DNS, right? So there's plenty of situations where it's just a simple error that causes pretty significant downtime. And so there's just hygiene in terms of operating procedures that I think are important to maintain service continuity. We do, of course, have the Russian and Chinese, and to a certain extent the Iranian cyber threats. Of course, we've seen Iran get a little more active in cyberspace with more visible attacks since the start of the U.S. Israel-Iranian conflict, with us being a target increasingly of some of those. Russia, again, I think has perhaps got the most history of executing destructive cyber attacks, at least at the moment. Most of that's contained to Eastern Europe, but much of the tradecraft that they're developing and practicing in Eastern Europe is equally applicable to U.S. infrastructure should they desire to target it in that direction. And then, of course, I think China and the PRC and the various elements, the PLA, MSS, and other organs of the offensive cyber apparatus within the PRC really represent the highest strategic consequence with, again, stated intent to gain access to our infrastructure to hold us at risk for strategic advantage. We're seeing a fundamental shift to cybersecurity, particularly in the realm of critical infrastructure, being used as a strategic deterrent against us. Again, from a strategy perspective, the idea is to again, in the scenario that was outlined, I think last year or the year before by the ODNI, it was to really cause societal panic and to prevent our ability to mobilize in response to our allies should there be a conflict, say, with Taiwan. If our telecom infrastructure and our rail infrastructure is not working, like rail is the primary means by which we mobilize fort to port in order to deploy. And so these things are all interdependent. And again, the PRC has a very specific playbook for what and how they would seek to disrupt that so that we are unable to militarily mobilize and that there is sufficient societal disruption that we question the importance of focusing on Taiwan when we don't have functional power in our own infrastructure, for example. So again, these are all things that are, again, real, they're happening, they're threat actors that are actively engaging in this, and we've seen significant evolution in the PRC's techniques and procedures as they look to do this in a way that's less detectable. Okay. So I talked a little bit about this already. There's lots of different layers to telecommunications infrastructure. And again, there's obvious differences depending on wireless versus wireline and sort of what pieces of infrastructure you have that you're responsible for. But all of these become potential threat environments. So the customer edge is obviously the perhaps most out there on the edge, right? It's always interesting the frequency with which we get a notification from the FBI that we should all go reboot our home routers, right? There's real stuff behind each of those. There's real reasons why there's these notices saying we should all go reboot our routers, and it's because they are a target for adversary exploitation, and there are, again, real threats that are being interdicted and managed as part of again, combating threats against that infrastructure. So when you see those, please go home and reboot your router. Also great to update your firmware. I wonder when the last time anyone updated the firmware on their home cable modem or FiOS router was. But again, these are all points of exploitation. There are also points where adversaries can camp out and leverage for larger botnet-style attacks. Let's see, other interesting parts of this. I talked a little bit about BGP. That becomes, again, another significant vulnerability. We've seen China actively experimenting with BGP spoofing in a way that would reroute traffic. I mean, there's been examples of the PRC rerouting traffic between Canada and I think one of their embassies in another country specifically to have it route through Beijing. There's certainly been a number of high-profile denial of service attacks, taking down pieces of infrastructure by mucking with BGP. I know there's been a lot of work over the last decade to really try and get some of the major PRC sort of BGP infrastructure points moved out of the U.S., and then efforts to adopt standards like BGP manners as a way to filter BGP routes. There's obvious there's a lot of database information that can tell you whether or not the routes you're getting are legitimate, and so if you just blindly trust all the BGP routes that you're receiving, then you create an opportunity for exploitation. And so there's a lot of best practices around how to filter that. There's of course RPKI and all the efforts to do encryption and authentication of BGP routing information. All of this, I think, will help protect against those sorts of attacks. Let's see, some other, as we get into the core network, this is where, in particular, wireless has seen a lot of vulnerabilities and threats. Over the last few years, we've seen this, there was a whole phase of targets against SS7. I know the FCC spent a lot of work looking at best practices for securing SS7 against adversary attacks. SS7 being the sort of legacy control plane infrastructure for telephony. We saw, again, 10, 15 years ago, a lot of foreign telco peering seeking to leverage the insecurity of SS7 for all kinds of different control plane attacks against U.S. infrastructure, with a number of academic groups demonstrating really what would be possible in these cases, with examples of everything from being able to geolocate individual phones, be able to kick individual phones off the network, be able to listen in on phone calls that are underway. All of this possible with insecurities in the lack of security at all in SS7. That, of course, led to efforts to really beef up SS7 filtering, firewall, intrusion detection type tools, really that the FCC helped drive. Diameter, of course, being the newer version of SS7 that actually does have security, but again is still not still hop-by-hop security. So depending on how your international roaming agreements are intermediated, there's still the potential for vulnerability there, particularly for sophisticated actors. So again, all of these represent, and then of course, I think with the Salt Typhoon, we saw more recently a lot of concern around lawful intercept infrastructure. So the cellular networks all have infrastructure in place to support CALIA for lawful intercept of telephony and other data services. And if those are exposed to adversaries, then they can use them for targeted eavesdropping on U.S. infrastructure as well. Billing systems, these end up looking like more traditional IT systems, and so traditional IT adversary tradecraft is more applicable to many of these things. This often becomes the entry point for a lot of things, and then when you look at ransomware, this is where a lot of the ransomware tools are designed to best operate, because again, it's consistent with again, more traditional IT networks. So the things, I don't know, if you're targeting a Microsoft enterprise installation, that's what you're going to find in these networks, not sort of custom control plane protocols that maybe are different. And so there's a lot of exposure just because they are so similar to all the other infrastructure, enterprise infrastructure out there that may seek to be exploited. Also, holding these at risk creates real revenue concerns for carriers. If they can't charge their customers for service, they lose revenue, and that is something that ransomware groups can exploit to their advantage. You've got the administrative fabric. Again, all of these things are just part of the overall tradecraft for how adversaries may seek to exploit and move through these networks, whether it's identity management or it's the VPN infrastructure that's securing interconnects between systems. All of this are things that adversaries can use for lateral movement through networks to be able to get from control plane to management plane to sort of business plane, if you will, of these networks, and seek to exploit. And then dependencies. So we've got telco doesn't operate in a vacuum. Telco is often the access path to cloud infrastructure. There's the MSP and MSSP infrastructure that is providing, again, managed security for many of these environments. And so if you're able to exploit the MSP or MSSP, you often are able to then access many potential vendors. And we've seen a number of threat vectors where targeting the small to medium-sized MSPs and MSSPs has led to adversaries being able to gain access to many targets all at once. And again, there's all the other interfaces we've talked about before in terms of other carriers they're peering with, public safety, and so forth. Okay. So digging into some of the criminal threats, just some statistics here. We've got, the point of this slide is just to say that this is a real threat and this is happening, right? So I think there's some data here from the Verizon 2025 report, but you can see 44% of breaches involved ransomware or extortion. 88% of small and medium-sized business breaches were ransomware related. So again, just statistically, ransomware is the largest threat actor going after most of the small to medium-sized business infrastructure. It's interesting, like it's not, if you look at sort of the tradecraft of the two groups, you've got the advanced persistent threats, the nation state hackers. They're the ones that have the whole quiver of 0 days that they're using to exploit and gain access to infrastructure. A lot of the ransomware is really more getting access to credentials or misconfigured systems, which are the primary access vectors. So 20% initial access was based on exploitation of vulnerabilities. 22% edge devices and VPNs being targeted as the access vector. Common impact pathways for telecommunications, billing and CRM. So I mentioned this before, right? If you go after the cash flow of the telcos, that's a really important point of leverage for ransomware. Provisioning and the OSS, or the management plane, new connects, service changes. Again, these can all cause service outages. Lots of other targets as well. You've got network management infrastructure. You've got identity and administrative infrastructure and backup infrastructure. Particularly if you're looking to prevent restoration as an alternative to paying the ransom, going after the backup infrastructure is often a key part of the adversary tradecraft for criminal organizations. If you kind of follow the MITRE ATT&CK concept, so MITRE ATT&CK sort of maps out tactics, techniques, and procedures for threat actor groups and to try and understand sort of the full life cycle of these attacks. You can think of them as attack graphs or attack chains or kill chains. But really, it's kind of what are all the steps in order that happen as an adversary seeks to gain initial access to your network, escalate privilege, move laterally, and then ultimately, in the case of ransomware, gain control and extort for the ransom. And so the initial access here is typically, it's a VPN, a firewall. You've got stolen credentials, phishing as a mechanism for that. All of those are part of the first phase. And so if you're looking really the first line of defense, it's how do you shore up all of those. The next phase is how do they escalate privilege? If you can't escalate privilege, then you're not able to perhaps accomplish as much as you would like. But there's a lot of things like stealing Active Directory tokens that you can use to escalate and move laterally. There's a lot of use of shared administrative accounts, the same admin password being used on lots and lots of systems, or default admin passwords still in place on systems. All of these are mechanisms for privilege escalation. Discovery, figuring out how to get through the network, figure out where the backups are, figure out where the most sort of extortable targets are, all part of the discovery phase. Control, right, this is turning off any of the defenses that you have so that they're not able to stop you, and then ultimately the encryption, leaking, and then extortion phase of these. I'd say really you want to make sure you've got the first two buckets locked down as much as you can, because those are going to be kind of the first two lines of defense that are going to make you a much harder target. And then also just make sure you've got good logging and your backups, right? One of my first jobs as in college was running the tape backup system for the computer science department at my college. And so every day after I'd go to the dining hall for dinner, I'd go in and switch the cassette tape for the tape backup. And I can't tell you the number of times that like those backups were critical. At one point we had the email server fell over and the hard drive did not survive the fall. And I lost all of the faculty's email inboxes, and I was not popular. But I had those tape backups. They're only a day old, and so we were able to restore them. Obviously, the stakes are a little bit higher now in modern network infrastructure. People aren't running their own little Solaris Unix LAN anymore, but the same principle applies. Back up your stuff and also practice recovery of your backups. Let's see. So getting into a few ransomware crews to look out for. I mean, these are 5 that are kind of most active at the moment and perhaps most relevant to the telco space and with some of the more sophisticated techniques. Again, don't need to go through each of them individually, but there's a whole series of CISA and FBI and other law enforcement reporting that comes out as we work to identify, attribute, interdict, and take down these different ransomware groups. So lots of threat actors out there, and as I pointed out before, sort of segmentation in the business model. So it's more than just these folks that are kind of the systems engineers, but you've got the groups that are mining credentials. You've got the groups that are you can now get paid in cryptocurrency to go find zero-day vulnerabilities. So there's like an entire economy that's been built out of the criminal cyber ecosystem because of ransomware being you're able, like, again, there's a financial ROI to all of it. So it's really been professionalized into a business at this point. So again, lots of bad guys out there. Another threat, again, just want to highlight, this was obviously, so distributed denial of service attacks and availability attacks, I'd say were a huge concern 10 years ago. They haven't been quite, I would say to a certain extent, the ransomware threat kind of supplanted them in the way that adversaries are seeking to hold at risk organizations. Distributed denial of service attacks, led by large botnets, for example, will provide a temporary service disruption. But unlike ransomware, where ransomware is a permanent service disruption, right? Whereas as denial of service attacks, you have to kind of keep the flood of bad packets coming in order for the effect to continue. So those are things like these volumetric flooding attacks, protocol attacks. All of these seek to cause disruption in the network infrastructure. And again, denial of service attacks are generally internet traffic-based attacks, and as a result, telco is sort of either the transit path or the potential target of that. So you can sort of see telco native risks as described here. And so much of our web infrastructure today is protected by organizations like Cloudflare that are helping sort of intermediate a lot of that web traffic to make it resilient to these sorts of attacks. But much of the telco infrastructure can't just be hosted away and sort of intermediated by Cloudflare. So many of the things that are designed to defend against denial of service attacks to web infrastructure, like that problem's largely been solved by companies like Cloudflare. There isn't an equivalent for some of the more localized infrastructure that you would have in a small to medium-sized carrier. And then if we kind of move into the telephony world, there's all kinds of unique risks here as well. You've got SIM swaps, you've got SIM cloning. There's of course this whole new wave of AI-driven voice scams that are possible. Before I got a spam firewall on my phone, I was probably getting 15 to 20 robocalls a day. These are all again, and telco is often the pipe through which a lot of these attacks are happening. There's been some other sort of uniquely telecom-related vulnerabilities in this space, things like telephony denial of service attacks or TDOS attacks. So this is where you would do a denial of service attack, but instead of it being traditional internet packet traffic, you would be a flood of inbound phone calls. And in particular, public safety answering points, or PSAP, 911 call centers are uniquely vulnerable to this because they may have, say, just a legacy T1 circuit switched line that can carry 24 simultaneous phone calls. And if you have a distributed set of phone calls that all happen at once, then you're now out of trunking capacity for circuit switched voice calls coming into a 911 answering point. And so we've seen examples of this with all sorts of concern around how could a criminal group in particular use these sorts of attacks to prevent emergency response from being effective in a criminal event, a bank heist to be dramatic, I guess, right? So these are, again, real concerns, real vulnerabilities in the system, and a lot of work over the last decade to try and figure out how do we identify and trace back these sorts of attacks. You've got robocalls and TDOS attacks are kind of inverse problems in terms of the shape. One is a single point going out to many people. One is many points going to a single. But both of them sort of exploit the vulnerability in the telephony switching infrastructure to cause denial of service sorts of functions. So again, these are all examples of things that are unique. I've got some other examples, I think later on, maybe I'll talk about some of them here in the nation-state space where there's been concern. So things like IMSI catchers have been another concern over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, where you've got fake base stations that are advertising themselves as a 2G base station with no encryption or security turned on, so they're able to spoof the carrier networks. And with that, they're able to basically convince regular cell phones to cough up the identity of that phone, the identity of the SIM card, the identity of the phone as part of the association. And then they can use that to track individual phones as they move around. They can also spoof phone calls. They can spoof text messages. We've seen these SIM farms as another example of that, where you've got large deployments of many SIMs inside of mobile devices that you could use for all sorts of different sort of telephony, SMS, and voice attacks. I mean, most recently, I think it was maybe a year or two ago, was all the SIM farms that were being discovered that had basically were being sold on the dark web to third parties who wanted to use them for robocalling or any number of different sorts of schemes to get access to a real phone, just sort of virtualized, that they could use for whatever fraud or other scheme that they had in mind. Okay. Make sure I'm on track here time-wise. I mentioned the sort of the MSP and MSSP concerns before, so I think this is all kind of what I talked about before, where you've got multiple telcos that are leveraging a single vendor as part of their supply chain, or a single MSP or MSSP These create kind of focal points for risk that then have upstream impacts on kind of shared users of that infrastructure. And I do want to highlight the interdependency between critical infrastructure sectors is really important here. It's kind of interesting. You can get into sort of this, like if the power grid goes down, then much of the internet infrastructure goes down. And the only way to bring the power grid back up is to have working internet. And so you end up in these sort of catch-22 systems where it's very difficult to bring infrastructure back up if any one of them have been exploited. Doing a black start on a large-scale power infrastructure is impossible without like real-time comms. And the systems that are designed to do that today leverage the internet as the backplane for all of that. So anyway, this creates, I guess, recovery paradoxes that require careful coordination between oil and gas infrastructure, between energy infrastructure, between telcos, all of them needing to work together to bring themselves all back online together. And much of, I think, the resilience that we want to talk about a little later necessitates being able to do that effectively. All right, so let's switch gears and talk about nation-state threats. As I mentioned before, I think what we're seeing in particular with the PRC is a shift from tactical and really focused on stealing information for the most part, and a movement towards looking to leverage cyber access as a strategic lever in a geopolitical conflict or engagement. And this is a pretty significant shift. The PRC is the first to kind of do this at scale, treating cyber as a strategic weapon. If you look at Russia, they are still kind of viewing it as a tactical weapon. It is an ends to a mean. It's a means to an ends for executing a specific tactical military operation, like we want to take out this particular Ukrainian target, and we want to have its upstream power infrastructure disrupted to enable that objective. And so it's really kind of a counter-force targeting. If you look at the world of nuclear conflict, we have counter-force targeting and counter-value targeting. Counter-force targeting is where you're specifically targeting military infrastructure as part of a military conflict. A counter-value is where you're targeting civilian infrastructure because you want to impose, basically hold at risk a larger population that would cause a deterrent effect in your adversary. It really is kind of the goal. And so what we're seeing is the PRC shift to this more counter-value mindset when it comes to targeting critical infrastructure. So if the power grid in the US stops working, again, that's certainly going to have effect on military targets, but it also has a major psychological effect on the entire population. And their ability to do it and our knowledge of their ability to do it then creates sort of this deterrence reinforcement where we would be, less likely to do something to annoy them because they know that we know that they know that we know that they can do this, right? And so my point being that China is the first to really jump all in on what I would describe as counter-value strategic targeting of cyber threats in a way that really creates their ability to project power, their ability to exert sort of a deterrent influence, not only over our use of cyber, but anything that we would do, from sanctions to military conflict to trade policy. Right? All of these things are kind of woven together. As I mentioned, Russia is still is perhaps the most sophisticated in terms of experientially doing disruptive and destructive attacks, but again, typically more limited in scope to specific conflict or crisis contexts rather than this grand sort of national strategy. Iran, I'd say very opportunistic exploitation, not quite as sophisticated as you look at some of the things that they did, I'd say, in the last couple months in cyberspace, ended up being very opportunistic cyber targets in the U.S., not really intellectually consistent with any particular military objective, but it was whatever access they happened to have and that they were able to take advantage of for media visibility at the end of the day. But nothing that would necessarily rise to the sort of strategic objectives that perhaps a China would, or the military objectives that Russia would. And then North Korea, right? Their Lazarus Group is their I don't know, national sports team, I guess, at this point. It is their ransomware enterprise that is out exploiting primarily cryptocurrency infrastructure. So they have become the masters of crypto heists and are actually really good at it, and are funding their nuclear weapons programs by going after everything from major exchanges to automated market maker, smart contract infrastructure that underpins different pieces of the Web3 and cryptocurrency ecosystem. And they have made billions of US dollars by exploiting these things. So a lot of it is to help prop up their economy. So again, the threat has evolved. Across the bottom, you can see just some examples of sort of year by year, some of the big examples that you'd see, particularly with PRC cyber activity, with, I'd say, Volt Typhoon being the kind of key threat in the early 2020s, Salt Typhoon picking up, and of course, Salt Typhoon very relevant to the telecom space, given their targeting of that infrastructure. Okay. A little bit more about the typhoons. Each of them represent a different piece of the CCP cyber apparatus. So you've got, much like in the U.S., you've got, you've got Cyber Command, you've got NSA, you've got CIA. So each of them have sort of different authorities that they're operating under in different contexts. The PRC has similar sort of equivalent agencies that each have different warrants when it comes to their cyber mission. And so the different typhoons broadly are reflecting kind of the heterogeneity of the different threat actors that you see in the PRC. Salt Typhoon has really gone all in on telecom access and espionage. And so that's been a sort of major in the media and very visible for the last 2 or so years. But in particular, the ability to get into, I'd say, broadly, it was a concerted effort against Cisco routers. I mean, Cisco is sort of one of the most ubiquitous brands here in the U.S., and it was a set of very capable 0 days and known configuration vulnerabilities and harvested credentials, and a concerted effort to go all in on using that information to go after the Cisco infrastructure that underpins much of our telecom infrastructure. And that's everything from core routers to edge routers to firewalls to much of the sort of database infrastructure that runs the control planes of these networks. That then gets them into things like the call data records, the CDRs. It gets it into the lawful intercept systems that are on the back end. Again, from there, the ability to use that, at least for now, for espionage purposes. But the level of access they have would then allow them also to pivot into more destructive cyber attacks, where they would be able to, initially cause sort of reversible effects like mucking up BGP routes all over the country. But from there, you could imagine destructive attacks where they're sort of wiping the core routing infrastructure that would fundamentally disable U.S. internet infrastructure. Volt Typhoon was a precursor. Again, it's another part of the CCP enterprise, but they were, I'd say, more visible about 5 years ago. A lot of their work was focused on critical infrastructure more broadly, not specifically telecom. Their strategy was long-term positioning. It was all about gaining access and sort of laying in wait, if you will, for future effect. They really perfected the notion of living off the land. So historically, threat actors would gain access, but then the first thing that they would do is install a rootkit or an implant, depending on your vocabulary. But the idea is you install malicious firmware or like kernel modules or low-level code in your target system that allows you to gain persistent access to it, knowing you always have a backdoor to get in. A challenge is that many of the security vendors got pretty good at finding these things. They got good at finding the rootkits. They got good at finding the software implants. And that then became a trigger that would alert, and you say, oh, you've been hacked. And so the living off the land strategy that Volt Typhoon really pioneered a few years ago said, well, we're going to stop installing backdoor code that could be discovered. Instead, we're just going to use the administrative infrastructure that already exists on these tools and just log in remotely as a valid administrator, rather than installing a backdoor that only we know about, but an adversary. But again, many of the security tools are now capable of finding. And that pivot meant that much of our detection infrastructure stopped working on Volt Typhoon because of this move. And so, being able to deal with adversaries who are living off the land is a critical part of, I'd say, a cyber defense, particularly because that's now the primary operating mode for the CCP threats are all living off the land. And then Flax Typhoon is sort of a third one. So here, broadly, their big mission has been covert infrastructure and proxying. So if you're able to exploit SOHO, IoT, all of this edge access infrastructure and maintain access to it, then you can use that as a waypoint for an attack against U.S. infrastructure. If you look at the majority of cyber attacks against U.S. infrastructure, it's coming from within the United States, and that's because of either access points and infrastructure that's like leased from our cloud providers, or it's because of exploited SOHO or other devices that are being used. I mean, there was the famous Mirai botnet from a few years ago, where I think it was like hundreds of thousands of smart refrigerators that were used as the underlying attack platform. Again, that was a different use case, but the point is, China has a fairly sophisticated overlay network that operates throughout our cloud infrastructure and our edge device infrastructure that is the jumping off point for all these other types of attacks. It's the upstream command and control infrastructure, the CNC infrastructure as it's called. Okay. A little bit more about Salt Typhoon, really sort of this idea of leveraging telecom as an intelligence platform. I mean, you're sitting in the middle of all the bit pipes of all the data moving back and forth, and so that's a really interesting spot to be burrowed and embedded into the system. And so you've got multiple U.S. telcos that were targeted, many of those sort of named publicly at this point. You've got global targeting. So again, while many of the initial targets were the United States, this has now expanded to Europe and other parts of the world as well, going after governments, transportation, military networks. While much of the initial access was just focused on routers and switches and things of that nature, once you're in at that layer, you now can kind of swim upstream into the control plane functions of the networks, which then allows you to do things like target call records and private communications and things of that nature. And then, again, the router focus really made the tools that they developed ubiquitously applicable across the entire internet. If our backbone infrastructure itself is being targeted, then allows a targeting of backbone infrastructure everywhere. So, and as I pointed out, it's not just the ability to steal data. It's not just the ability to sort of snoop on telephony infrastructure, but it also is sort of a large-scale prepositioning for a potential destructive attack should there be interest in doing that. Again, I think there's a lot. I mean, certainly it's important to small and medium telcos. I think it's important to anybody with an IP address, really. This is, I'd say, one of the most significant threats that U.S. infrastructure faces is from the level of access that the PRC has gained through Salt Typhoon-style compromises. But again, as we talked about before, small and medium telcos are sitting in the middle of lots of really important pieces of the puzzle. And exploitation there results in the ability to move laterally into many of these other infrastructures or have impacts in these other infrastructures. So if I'm the PRC and I want to be able to disrupt all sorts of more regional critical infrastructure, like water infrastructure, like hospitals, like local power generation, being in the more regional network infrastructure is the perfect positioning to be able to swim into all of those spaces, and also to be able to command and control anything that I am doing in those spaces, and knowing that I've got a comms path to do it. If there's already a Volt Typhoon style access in many of these other systems, then the ability to leverage really the Salt Typhoon style accesses in telecom as really that command and control layer is exactly is one of the major concerns that we have here. But again, because of their location, visibility, so they know who talks to who, they understand all the dependencies, they understand precisely the network topology. It's another big thing that's been happening, is leveraging that access to map out in nitty-gritty detail all of the connectedness of the US infrastructure. Pivoting into these trusted connections, as I mentioned. Persistence, you're persistently in the middle of all of these things. And then recovery drag. So if there is an attack, then this presence would make it a lot harder for us to track down and be able to respond to it. Volt Typhoon, I think I've talked about some of these things already, but living off the land, as I mentioned, is a really important piece of the puzzle, and it makes it a lot harder for us to detect them because the detection signatures, the things that you would look for and from a signature perspective look just like legitimate administrators logging in and managing these systems. So being able to tell the difference between adversary exploitation and access and legitimate access exploitation is the challenging part. And I know we've been involved at MITRE in programs to try and develop these signatures, and every time we think we've got a good way to track a particular type of Volt Typhoon living off the land behavior, they switch their tactics, and suddenly we can't find them again. So it's a constant cat and mouse game as you look at doing threat hunting for Volt Typhoon style living off the land attacks. Because once they kind of know, oh, well, we're visible because of our lateral movement technique shows up in this type of logging in your Active Directory, and if you know to look for that, then you know that Volt Typhoon's in your system, then they can adapt, change their TTPs, and now the thing you thought you knew would always find them now isn't working. And does that mean they have adapted or they're not there anymore? And in many cases, it means they've adapted and they're doing something that now is less detectable. The other thing is oftentimes these things start within the IT infrastructure and then pivot into OT. If you look at, so the MITRE attack framework, we have attack for ICS, or industrial control systems, which includes a whole bunch of techniques that are unique to SCADA and OT networks. But if you look at attack for ICS, like 80% of it is just regular attack, because 80% of going after these OT systems starts in the IT systems. And so, again, Volt Typhoon has perfected that, where they are really getting in and owning the IT infrastructure, and then from there pivoting into the OT systems as needed to have specific effects. Okay. And I've talked a bit about compromised routers and IoT devices as strategic infrastructure. Again, this is as you're looking at building the capacity for large-scale projection of power in cyberspace, the Flax Typhoon and these covert networks become the real highway for these attacks, because they've got beachheads all over our networks and are able to use them for effect. Russia, Iran, North Korea, as I mentioned, their TTPs are a little bit different. I think, as we've talked about, Russia's, again, remained more focused. Again, they're the masters at disruption and sabotage, but it's typically more localized in effect. Iran, more opportunistic exploitation. North Korea focused on ransomware. And again, there's lots of examples of these threat actors, lots of advisories out there. Yeah. Also interesting, I'm sure folks have been tracking some of it on the news, North Korea's use of a lot of these remote work scams. I'm chairman of the board of a joint venture that MITRE operates, and we had our first North Korean remote worker scam. I was so proud. Like that's a milestone in any small business, is you're being targeted by some IT remote worker scam out of North Korea at this point. Again, small telcos should plan for this opportunistic exploitation, particularly during times of geopolitical stress. You've got the persistent PRC campaigns, and then there's all the opportunistic stuff that's happening one layer down. Again, a lot of the same. This graph here is going to look a lot like what you saw in the ransomware and criminal slides that I had previously, although the strategic objectives are different, right? It's not about extortion anymore. It's about potentially disruptive attacks for national effect. So again, you'll see something very similar here. And the solutions are really the same, focusing on the first two layers from a defensive perspective and making sure that you've got all that. And then rather than sort of backup restoration kind of practicing on the back end, it's going to be recovery from outages, and how do you manage that on the back end? Okay. So let me just briefly talk about some cross-sector dependency risks. As I mentioned, telecom is really that highway that's interconnecting everybody else, and so there is all of this cross-sector dependency that is critical. We've got there's a sort of a set of lifeline sectors as defined by CISA. These are the, I guess, the more critical of the critical infrastructure sectors. And so you've got energy infrastructure, so SCADA telemetry, substations, field crews. There's water infrastructure. There's emergency services, transportation, finance, cloud IT. All of these are lifeline functions that are interdependent on one another. And of course, telecom sitting here in the middle is the transit and management and recovery mechanism. If you can't pick up the phone and call someone, it can be hard to respond and recover from an attack. And so the comms backbone is critical to all of these sectors. So much so that, I mean, some of the ISACs and others have created these different cross-sector groups that are really trying to support a lot of the cross-sector activity. One of the things that we found is, like here as part of the critical infrastructure defense ecosystem that we have in the United States, we've got a lot of vertical integration. Everybody's organized by sector. Everybody's got an ISAC that's focused on their sector. You've got a coordinating council focused on your sector. You've got an SRMA focused on your sector. All of it is sector aligned. But if you imagine a scenario where the PRC actually does move forward with a large-scale, persistent, disruptive, destructive attack against U.S. critical infrastructure, that vertical alignment really breaks down, because disruptions to energy in California and energy in I don't know, Massachusetts are, like, yes, there's a relationship between the two, but as you're trying to do the response and recovery, the interdependency between all of these folks means that the relationships between those two energy operators is less important than the local relationship between the local telcos, the local transportation providers, the local water infrastructure, the local energy providers. And so I guess it would have been now 14, 15 months ago at MITRE, we hosted a cross-sector critical infrastructure tabletop exercise where we had 5 different cities represented, and we had 5 different lifeline sectors for each of those regions represented, so 25 total. And we ran through an intelligence-informed set of scenarios leading up to and then during a Straits of Taiwan scenario. And we looked at, well, what's likely to happen? How is each of the utilities, the asset owner operators, able to manage through? At what point do they start breaking, and at what point does the interdependency between folks start breaking? And the biggest, loudest conclusion from all of this, and a lot of the feedback we got, was that, I don't know, we had the asset owner operators and the emergency response groups from a city had never met each other before, right? And like at that tabletop, they're all exchanging business cards because like if this happens for real, we got to like know each other and be able to respond together. There's also a lot of there's no real strategic command and control that we have as a nation. So there is no ability for the White House to step in and try to manage a national cross-sector, multi-region cyber attack. Many of the utilities and the emergency response infrastructure is local and is maybe knows to talk to the mayor or the governor, but couldn't imagine, like, there is no comms pathway to the White House. And so figuring out how to coordinate some of the national response becomes particularly challenging. And so, like, our advice out of all of this is that the biggest thing we need to do is practice. We've got to build those relationships. We've got to exercise and drill and figure out how to do recovery and response and recovery together. Response and recovery in isolation is a great start, but response and recovery together is going to be critical because of the interdependencies between all of these. I've got a couple slides here on like if I was going to do another tabletop, what are the sorts of things that I would want to focus on. Given I think I'm almost out of time here, I'll put these up, but there's sort of a playbook here for really one of the biggest things is how can we get local regions working together and hosting their own tabletops and exercises, and could the power infrastructure continue to operate if it didn't have access to the internet or the cloud? How dependent is a utility on cloud connectivity to operate? And if you have a dependency there, like how can you mitigate that dependency? How can you practice operating without that infrastructure in order to create, to try and decouple some of these cross-sector connectivities? So I think, again, some more things if you were going to look at some of the tabletops, things to talk about. And then I think I will probably stop here because the rest of my slides were really going to steal the thunder of the panel. And so I'll let the panel steal its own thunder. And yeah, with that, I will be done.
Thanks so much, Charles, for that great presentation, which really underscores some of the clear and present threats that telecommunications service providers are facing today. We'll move into a short 10-minute break before the panel on best practices for cybersecurity management, which will start around 11:25. Restrooms are located just outside these two doors if folks need. Thanks. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Now we'll turn it over to Leon Kenworthy, Chief of the Public Safety Bureau's Cybersecurity and Communications Reliability Division, to introduce and moderate our panel. Over to you, Leon.
Thank you, Zoe. Good morning, everyone. Charles presented a very sobering picture of a rapidly changing threat environment for communications service providers that is getting more sophisticated every day. Criminal cyber actors and foreign adversaries exploit vulnerabilities to steal information and money, or worse yet, to develop capabilities to disrupt, destroy, or threaten the delivery of critical services to Americans. Telecommunications networks are vulnerable to attack, and every service provider, regardless of size, should be prepared for these attacks. And in this session, we're going to pivot to the steps that you can actually take to secure your networks. We'll hear from a panel of experts from industry and government about actions that providers can take to improve their capabilities and mitigate the risk of cyber attacks by implementing proven best practices. Joining us today, starting immediately to my right for those in the room, is Dr. Eric Berger, Research Director of the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative, who holds appointments as Research professor of electrical and computer engineering and research professor of public policy at Virginia Tech. His research includes investigating how to bring government and Tier 1 level cybersecurity protections to small and medium-sized carriers, best practices for public and private corporations, and cyber threat intelligence sharing. Next, we have Jeff Sachonsky, the lead for advanced communications cybersecurity at NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, where he directs research into the security and resilience of next-generation cellular networks. He currently leads the 5G cybersecurity project at the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, spearheading development of practical standards-based reference architectures that demonstrate real-world security capabilities, such as hardware-enabled roots of trust and subscriber privacy protections. Next, we have John Marino, Vice President of Technology and Cybersecurity at CTIA. He leads efforts to help the wireless industry secure networks and devices against cybersecurity threats, implement industry technology programs, and advocate for sensible and practical regulations based on industry-led solutions. Finally, we have Scott Paretsky from Ericsson, Director for Security Policy and Standards and Ericsson America's Strategy and Technology team. He has over 30 years of industry experience in a variety of networking and security technologies. So, let's dig in. I think to get us started, let's focus on the basics. What would you recommend as the most critical best practices for a resource-limited telecommunications provider to implement today? And I'd like to hear all of your thoughts on this topic, but maybe we can start with Jeff, given NIST's role in developing the cybersecurity framework and guidance that's specifically designed for small entities.
Yeah, I think it's an important question, and thanks to the hosts and having us here today. It's a critical topic to be discussing. At NIST, we have a lot of cybersecurity best practice. There's a lot of guidance and resources to help organizations manage their cybersecurity risk. And one of the most kind of critical pieces or critical products we've put out in the last 10 years has been the cybersecurity framework. And it's really a product and a tool that can help organizations organize and get started, kind of understanding the steps of the process of cybersecurity risk management. I think we're going to talk a bit more about what the framework entails and cybersecurity risk in general, but that product and that resource as a starting point, looking at identifying the assets you have, understanding what's in your networks, what's in your systems. It's one of the most critical things you need to start with in order to protect those assets and protect your networks. From there, just not a NIST product or guidance within that process, and what I've seen in the work in this space is kind of a practical example of what we need to do to actually kind of increase our cybersecurity protection is, like, let's look at changing those default and test credentials. It's really sounds like an easy thing, but I can guarantee we're going to find places that changing just something as simple as a test credential or a configuration credential is going to break something else. And it's a challenging step, but I think it's very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Eric, thoughts on the subject?
Certainly, and as Jeff alluded to, we in the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative in Virginia Tech, we've been working with NTIA. They had a first round of grants, and in that first round, we were looking at how do we protect everyone else. So the tier ones do a pretty good job of protecting themselves, but what about the tier twos and tier threes? And some of my students came back after basically they were taxed with, here, set up a wireless network, follow the directions, and what did you find? And they were like, oh yeah, all the default passwords are set. And I'm like, what do you mean? Didn't you follow the directions? And they're like, there was nothing there. So that is some of the low-hanging fruit. One of the results of that work was another NTIA grant, which we call the Wireless Heart of America. Again, how do we now create the structures for the smaller carriers to protect themselves? And so we mapped out things like and I'll do this tongue-in-cheek, you can no longer call Huawei the one vendor to fix everything for you. And it's not because it's Huawei, but because we are moving to multi-vendor solutions. So actually understanding what you have in your network, who are you going to call, who is responsible and accountable for what. I can say the carrier is accountable, having been a former FCC senior official. The carrier is the entity on the hook. But who's really going to do that work for them?
John, Scott?
So, Leon, thank you for the opportunity to join you today, as well as thanks to the FCC on this very important topic. And I'd like to not only echo everything that Jeff and Eric just talked about, but also to highlight the fact that we do a lot of work with small and mid-sized carriers at CTIA, because they're our members, and we do a lot of outreach when it comes to cybersecurity. And there are a few basic principles that we really rely upon, which is the whole notion of a risk assessment, and that every carrier network, every organization is different, and that risk assessment has to take that into account, because then, the mitigations, the response, the recovery then has to correspond to that. But the most important thing beyond that is the fact that cybersecurity is a team sport. So it's not just one individual in the organization that takes on accountability. No, it's got to be something that's organizational. It's got to be something that's part of the culture of the team, of the group that understands the impacts that these threats can have on their company, on their business, on their organization, identifying the assets, prioritizing what are often referred to as the crown jewels, and then really, doing what Jeff talked about, which is, there are the basics, and the basics really cover off a big percentage of the threats that you might see. Simple things, again, like default passwords. So all of these things, we work very closely with the small and medium-sized businesses to address, because the trade association is a resource to that segment of the industry, and it's an important role that we try to fulfill, as well as kind of connecting the dots between what happens in CISRIC, what happens in the COM-ISAC, what happens with DHS, what happens with the FBI, but then how do you propagate that down to something that's digestible, something that is useful to a small and mid-sized carrier. And it's worked reasonably well. Certainly, we're always looking for improvements. We're always looking to do better. But it's that blocking and tackling that I think is really the crux of how we address the challenges that we heard from Charles Clancy. Scott?
Yeah, so right on target, John. FCC CISRIC has produced excellent guidance. NIST has many documents, not just CSF, that I think are huge value for the industry. CISA, DHS CISA, so for those online who don't know, that's the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, also produces excellent guidance. And one that I think is the first to go to is the Enhanced Visibility and Hardening Guidance for Communications Infrastructure. So note first, for communications infrastructure, it was written for our industry, and it specifically targets operators in our industry and their vendors. Also, when you go to download this, note the date, December 2024. Yes, this was in response to Salt Typhoon, and in fact, on the web page, they name names. So this is in response to Salt Typhoon. And here is excellent guidance to start the foundational things, the blocking and tackling, including encrypting passwords and don't use default passwords, but also vulnerability patching, so important, network segmentation, end-to-end encryption with approved, NIST-approved ciphers, use TLS and MTLS 1.3. If you're on 1.2, I can understand you're probably still migrating. But if you're on 1.0 or 1.1, forget about it. MFA for user access. And then make sure you disable unused protocols and deprecated ciphers. And then really, to me, the foundation of it all is the continuous monitoring for all of this, because you need to monitor also for configuration drift in addition to behaviors on your network. So please go reference this CISA Enhanced Visibility and Hardening Guidance for Communications Infrastructure from December 2024. That's an excellent starting point.
Thanks. I think that's some really helpful, practical guidance. And just to pull out a few things that I heard there, I mean, there's password management, including changing default passwords, multi-factor authentication, network segmentation, identifying the key assets in your systems. All important points that we're gonna talk about in a little more detail during today's panel. So I think moving on to the next question, what are your recommendations for getting started with developing a cybersecurity risk management plan for companies out there that maybe have considered cybersecurity risk but haven't thought of it in a comprehensive way and thought of the structure they want to put in place to manage that risk? What would your recommendations be? Is there a short form approach for smaller companies to ensure that they're covering the basics? And I'll start with Jeff again on this one because of the NIST equities, but I promise we'll spread things around in future questions.
Yeah, and I can be short. I think another resource and a great team we have is a dedicated team focused on kind of cybersecurity for small business. I think the website or the resource online is the NIST Cybersecurity Small Business Corner. And within there's folks that have spent a lot of time developing kind of quick start guides for some of these cybersecurity tasks, including kind of developing kind of your initial cybersecurity plan. Those quick start guides, they try to boil it down in layman's terms for folks that maybe are wearing multiple hats. They're not cybersecurity engineers. They're people that are, as Charles mentioned in his presentation, they're farmers or responsible for managing infrastructure, but they need to accomplish this as well. So the idea is to boil these concepts down and provide kind of that stepping stool in a short format to help. That's one resource. I'm sure John and Eric and Scott have other examples as well of what they've seen in their experience.
Yeah, does anybody else want to talk on this?
No, I was going to
question?
jump in because there's one document that's really high on the popular list for us, which is the NIST Quick Start Guide for Small Business, which tries to put into very simple, easy to understand ways to develop what a risk assessment plan would look like. There's a wealth of documentation and approaches that NIST recommends, everything from the CSF to risk management frameworks to how to deal with supply chain. There are industry best practices that we publish, other trade associations also publish. But I think going back to the fundamentals and the 80 to 86 publication series of risk management are really the basics, so that you can just basically hand it to someone and there's a menu and a easy to understand approach that they can take to get started, so that they can, build incremental success into developing their cybersecurity plan. Because, not only is it a team sport, but it's a journey. It's not a destination. You're always, addressing cybersecurity, always looking for improvements. But it's a good way to get started, because if you try to digest everything that's in the CSF, it can be daunting. Again, that's why having that kind of documentation that Jeff referenced is absolutely critical.
Eric, you look like you've got something to add.
Yeah, thanks. So I want to give you two sides of the same coin. You've heard a lot of documents today. There's a plethora of documents, and small business website, and I'll put in a pitch for the FCC's cyber advice page. Very good place to start. And the other thing is, I'll push back a little bit and then say, yes, you're right. The pushback I will make is CSF 1.0, the cybersecurity framework, was about 12 pages. The appendix is substantially longer. But, this is not, oh, you need to be a PhD professor to figure this out, and it's going to take me weeks to read it, so I won't even start. It's digestible. And the reason why I point that out is one of the things, and I was involved with the creation of that back, and not as NIST. They did a really good job of getting input from industry and academia at that time, is the inclusion of the C-suite. This is, yes, we're talking, and we've given you so far a lot of technical advice, passwords, and if, for the recording, MFA, multi-factor authentication. These are all really important technical things to do, but you really need the support and buy-in of your C-suite, which I believe we're going to hear more about in the afternoon.
Well, and maybe if I could pull on that thread a little bit more, what are your recommendations for cybersecurity practitioners at a provider in getting their C-suite involved, making sure that everyone at the organization understands the risks and is part of developing the plan so that if there's a cyber incident, they know who has what role in executing that plan, but even just short of an actual incident, everyone understands their sort of day-to-day responsibilities in maintaining good cyber hygiene. I don't know if, John, you want to start with that?
Sure. And I think the most important part of this is to develop a plan and a way to respond so you're not figuring it out on the fly. Colonial Pipeline was the best example of nobody ever thought that could happen, and it did, and they were figuring it out in real time. That is the worst possible time to address how do you respond to an incident. That's why, there's this whole notion of break glass and having a plan so that, you don't expect the firefighter to figure out how to hook up the hose when they pull up to the incident, right? You want them to know. You want them to figure out exactly what are all the steps that need to be followed, and what do you do if it's a ransomware attack? What do you do if it's compromised credentials? What do you do? Again, you just go down the list, but you've got to develop that plan in advance. You've got to be able to use that plan when something happens, and you know exactly who's going to do what, when, because you can't be figuring it out when you're in the middle of the incident. So that's absolutely critical, and there are plenty of examples to highlight to senior executives what can go wrong and how it impacts the business, how it impacts their customers. We've had examples of that with small and mid-sized carriers here in the United States. And indeed, those lessons, again, serve to make the point that it is a team sport. Everybody's involved, including the C-suite, and everybody needs to participate in defining what that plan is. There are lots of resources to help, but again, the best advice and the thing that we think is most important that practitioners need to address is you need to have a plan so that when something happens, and it will, you're just executing and you're following the plan across all the different disciplines, everything from the technical to PR, to what you communicate to the press, to what do you communicate when the regulator calls you up and says, okay, what's going on? All of those things need to be well thought through and understood, and everybody needs to be part of that response plan.
Eric, do you have additional thoughts on getting the C-suite involved?
Yeah, so being former C-suite at 3 public companies, you get like a different perspective. For example, not only is your incident response team on speed dial, your outside counsel is on speed dial, your marketing communications, your PR firm is on speed dial. And by the way, this is part of the arguments for your own boards and your own C-suite that, as John said, you can't do this by the fly. In the public company sphere, the National Association of Corporate Directors have a good, deep library. Again, how to look at this from the C-suite perspective. A lot of what we've been talking about on the NIST side is kind of for the CISO level and the VP of networks level. But there's a whole host, and again, a lot of these white papers are 8 pages long. We're not asking you to go to your boss and say, here, read this 300-page document, and then you'll understand where I'm coming from. They're just cared about what is the impact on the business. And I think you'll come away from Dr. Clancy's talk in the morning that this is not something that happens to someone else. This is not something that only happens to the big guys. In fact, the littler entities, so not just picking on small carriers, but small companies, small and medium-sized enterprises are the next level that are being targeted. So that's what I would bring in message.
Yeah, so my message to the C-suite takes a more inspirational level, and that is our networks that we operate are critical infrastructure. Our telecom networks are the backbone for commerce, public safety, healthcare, manufacturing, transportation. Really, our everyday lives are dependent upon these networks. And isn't it great that we get to operate a business that provides so much benefit to society? But with that responsibility also comes the responsibility of ensuring that these networks are secure. C-suite understands that because that really is the foundation of the business. So with that message, we can help get that support.
Couldn't have put it better myself. Okay, so one of the things that was mentioned when we talked at the beginning about important steps that providers can take right now was the importance of inventory, identifying and maintaining an inventory of your assets. I think that can be a daunting task for some companies. There's sometimes very sprawling networks with a lot of different equipment. For a resource-constrained company, is there a practical approach that can be used to identify and prioritize assets that are most critical or most at risk? In other words, the quote-unquote crown jewels of the company. And Scott, let's start with you.
All right, yeah, so I have a few things here. This is where I would start. First one is make sure in your network you're using only trusted vendors, those that are not on the FCC covered list. So then once you can establish that, then you can start identifying and prioritizing assets in your network for implementing your risk management plan and implementing your security controls. Where would I start? I would start with first at the edge. Your assets at the edge are the ones that are internet facing. You need to make sure those systems are secure and the interfaces out to the internet are secure. Next one is protect data. And there's 2 types of data here that are the priority. First one is your customer's data. That's the personal identifiable information, the PII. By regulation in many states, you are required to ensure the security of that data. And then also there's sensitive network data. You want to make sure that is secure as well. And when I say secure, I mean it from 2 perspectives. You want to make sure you have secure access to the data, and then in the event someone were able to escalate privilege and bypass access and get to that data, it needs to be encrypted and integrity protected. So you need to secure it from both of those perspectives. You also need to treat identity as an asset. So make sure credentials are secured. Your passwords must be encrypted. Make sure you're securely storing keys and certificates. And then the next item on the priority list are your management systems, and now in cloud environments, our service orchestration systems. Because if anyone were able to get access to those, they'd really have the keys to the castle. So you need to make sure those are secure. Now, once you've implemented security or identified how you're going to secure those top assets, I would then go to another CISA document, which is the Zero Trust Maturity Model, which has pillars of identity, devices, network, cloud applications, and workloads. And you could start then working on your next level of prioritization based on what that is in that document there.
Thanks. I'll open it up to others that want to chime in.
One thing I would add to what Scott just said, which was a great list, is the fact that we've seen recently threats where bad actors are not going after the small to mid-sized carrier, but they're going after the carrier's customer and the access that the customer has to the carrier's network, particularly enterprise customers, and going after the security vulnerabilities that may exist in the customer's network, and then the ability to then move into the carrier's network through that access. And that is another place to look in terms of identifying assets, because your customers are assets, but they're assets to the bad actors, and you've got to think through how that could be exploited and what is that relationship that you want to maintain in terms of what level of security. And I'll share with you some simple things, which is just low-hanging fruit, which is, have we recommended to our small and medium-sized carriers that for their customers to have access to their network, that they should all use multi-factor authentication? It's those kinds of basic steps. And they hadn't thought through, they thought it through for their own network and their own perimeter. But they hadn't necessarily extrapolated that to, the networks that their customers are using to access their carrier network.
Yeah, I think, and in addition to what John and Scott said, boiling it back to the question of how do we do inventory and how do we do inventory in a constrained environment, there's not really I don't have an easy shortcut. It's real work that takes some grit to understand exactly what you're running. Just in my lab that I run, it's a 5G network, but it's literally one room. It's a headache to do inventory. So it is real work to understand what you're operating, and then from there you have the ability to kind of lay that out and understand how these systems work. What are the dependencies? And I think Scott was getting to it, and John were getting to it as well, is there are some very critical components in these systems that I think you used the term crown jewels, but how do we isolate and ensure that those components are kind of, a spotlight is on them for our internal constrained employees, and we understand that they're running in a kind of in a way that is as we would expect, or a good fashion, and that they haven't been compromised.
Yeah, and part of it is having someone going around with the scanner, scanning the tags. And in the deep, dark past, that was almost enough. But today, we are running this softwareized telecommunications network. So it's not enough to know that, I've got this server here. It's what's in the server. And so there are a lot of commercial and other tools to probe your network. So that doesn't mean, now I don't need to go. You still need to go around and see what's there. But also, of course, the most interesting and often scary are what are the things that are on your operational network that you don't know about? That someone, and this happens at any size enterprise and carrier, someone plugged something in because they needed something done, and that's part of that insider thing. The insider threat is not always, someone has been paid off to attack the network. They're trying to get their job done, and so they're doing something kind of outside the scope. The other thing, Charles talked a lot about, watch out for your perimeter. And again, in the old days of last year, there's this divide between your information technology systems, the billing systems, the operation support systems, the provisioning systems, and the operational technology. For us, it would be the switching systems, but you can also imagine if it's power, it's the power control systems and all that. And what I've been trying to say for 25 years now, and finally it's happening, there is no difference. no matter how much you say that they're firewalled, no matter how much you say, oh, it's different segmented networks, kind of the point is to be able to have all this interesting operational information in your information technology systems and to be able to base decisions on your operational systems based on what's going on in the IT systems. So again, for good reason, there is no firewall there, which I think we're going to get to talking about things like zero trust and all that. How do we deal in that kind of world?
Yeah, well, on that note, and Scott, you talked about the importance of securing assets at the network edge, which is obviously critical. But at the same time, traditional perimeter-focused network defense is no longer sufficient. Once a bad actor gets into the walled garden of the network, they can move laterally, they can cause a lot of damage. So, what best practices provide the additional controls and techniques that are needed to better detect intrusions, protect assets, and reduce impacts when a compromise does occur?
Right. So one of the things Salt Typhoon showed us is the need for a zero trust architecture. Anyone that was questioning whether or not zero trust or ZTA had any value, well, that question really got answered with Salt Typhoon. Because with Salt Typhoon, we had this sophisticated nation-state threat actor establishing the beachhead and then exploiting other vulnerabilities inside the network, weak credentials, unencrypted passwords, for example, security misconfigurations in the network, and then moving laterally through the network with the purpose of reconnaissance, taking control of a network, maybe even disruption or an outage. So now that we've seen with Salt Typhoon that there can be, that this threat is real. There can be a sophisticated actor inside the network. We really need to take this zero trust mindset where we consider that the adversary is already inside the network. And this is where zero trust architecture from NIST is highly valuable. And this only was published in September 2020. And it was almost like NIST had a crystal ball and could see what was coming soon in the future, because this has proven to be hugely valuable, having this zero trust architecture that we can reference. And I can tell you in the ORAN Alliance, where I chair the Workgroup 11 Security Workgroup, we very much use the NIST ZTA and what I really consider a companion document, the CISA ZTMM, the Zero Trust Maturity Model, as we're building secure standards that consider the insider threat in addition to the external threats. And this is a really important point when you're doing that threat analysis and risk analysis that we've been talking about, because traditionally we've only been looking at external threats, which means that the controls that we implement are to defend against the external threat actors. If we're now thinking about the internal threats, it really extends further the kinds of controls we need to implement, because we need to implement them inside the network on our internal interfaces and for our internal resources. The Zero Trust Architecture from NIST, the 207 document, has 7 tenets of zero trust. And I get asked a lot, how do those 7 tenets apply to us in the telecom industry? And there's 4 ways here. So the first one is network microsegmentation. And then also your most critical assets must be secured as micro perimeters. So each of those critical assets need to be secured as if there is no perimeter protecting it anymore. So take that kind of mindset. The next thing is have continuous authentication and authorization. We can no longer trust anyone, even inside the network. And then the third thing is secure all your data, data in transit and data at rest, even that data in transit across internal interfaces. And then the fourth thing that we've been talking about quite a bit is make sure you implement that continuous monitoring with proper logging And now there are plenty of AI tools, AI-driven tools that are available that can quickly process all of this data to identify for us when there is an anomaly and maybe even, heaven forbid, an incident.
Yeah, I'd love to add, and it's so interesting working on this because I mean this is almost like everyone has such nice things to say about all of the work that that we put out. Scott is obviously more of an expert in our zero trust publications and the tenants. I know all the work that he's put in the ORAN Alliance working group. More of an expert than I am, but some of this kind of where I sit and what I see is also interesting because one hat I'm sitting. I put on and I attend these standards meetings. I go to 3GPP where we're starting to define what the 6G standards are going to look like, right? We're talking about the future, what security protections are needed there, how are we going to prevent X, Y, and Z. And when you look at that, that's 2030, 2035 until we actually see equipment being deployed. And then another hat is kind of these conversations and the work we're doing at the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, where we've built out a 5G testbed, working with industry very closely with their kind of products that they have provided to build out this testbed to understand how do we do the things Scott just mentioned? How do we leverage what's in the existing technology today to actually kind of achieve some of those tenets? And the quick answer again is it's not easy. A lot will go into that, and I think Eric hinted at it back when he was talking about kind of property scanning and what used to be okay. I mean, I think there's around 20, 30 operators in the U.S. My understanding is 3 to 5 of them are actually running a full-fledged, kind of from a mobile network perspective, full-fledged 5G standalone system, which means they're kind of at the cutting edge. They're running cloud technology. Their single, what used to be a single network function plugged in some rack in physical space that you could scan is now 45 pods. Each pod is 60 containers running across 2 data centers to provide the same functionality. So the complexity is increasing, but with that complexity kind of gives us the ability to plug in the best practices and the tools that Scott was really pointing to. How do we do continuous monitoring in that kind of cloud environment? Well, it turns out we're really good at it because we have a lot of cloud providers, a lot of kind of IT security expertise in that space that we can bring over in this kind of telco world. It's an interesting place to be. I think there's a lot of hope, but there is obviously, as the list that Scott kind of checked through, there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Just to add one thing to that, because I hear this a lot from our small and mid-sized carriers, is can you give me a ZTA for dummies that I can use? Because it is daunting. There's a lot to be done, and a lot has changed. In the old days, you had something that was called a central office. Well, that's been virtualized, and it now sits in the cloud. And it's daunting for small and mid-sized carriers, and I think this is an area or an opportunity to really help in the context of not only best practices and all the things that need to get done, but also to make it easy to do, to make it something that's easily accessible by small and mid-sized businesses so that it doesn't become an obstacle for them to embrace.
Yeah, I want to touch upon a few things. One is exactly that. And since I had my shout out to NTIA, I'll do my shout out to NSF. Some funded research there on using LLMs, not just for the log analysis, but how to make it so that an analyst can come up with the problem, identify that it's not false positive, come up with a solution in 15 minutes instead of today what takes about 6 hours. So thank you, NSF, for that. Another thing is when I was, I can say this out loud in this building. I used to work for 2 carriers, in fact. And one thing I was taught back in those dark days was nothing ever comes out of the network. once we put something in, it like basically stayed there until it melted, and then okay, we'll upgrade it. And yeah. At first we were like, no, yeah. So another NSF project that we've completed now called Tenko is how to bring zero trust architecture to a lot of these legacy devices. How to like shrink down the attack surface. A little bit of history and then a public service announcement. The history is, yes, NIST talked about zero trust architecture in 2020. Yes, we won't name who, but there was a consulting firm that came up with the term around 2010, 2009. And the IETF has been building zero trust protocols since 1996. And the number of times people would come and say, oh, but I don't need to authenticate all the endpoints because, oh, it's just running in a rack, or, oh, it's all in my box. And we would say, no, if it's an internet protocol, we have to assume nothing is trusted. And then the public service announcement, which I will, pitch NIST again. Special Publication 800-63, which is the identity series. There are 4 in that series. B talks about how you know that identity is accurate. And what I really like about it is risk-based, because it goes from, if it's a toy, use a password. But then the next one is multi-factor authentication, all the way through to although NIST wouldn't be doing nuclear launch codes, NIST does deal with like the integrity of the financial system. And there you're talking, here in the building, it would be PIV cards, CAC cards, smart cards, biometrics. Please, so this is not for your C-suite to read, but if you're responsible for protecting your networks, SMS is a great 2-factor authentication for ordering a pizza. It is not the best 2-factor authentication for high-risk assets. And as Scott so eloquently said, our telecommunications network is an extremely high-risk asset. So there are a lot of tools that are not nuclear weapons grade, meaning nuclear weapons cost, that you can implement, such as the one-time pads you have. Probably you've seen the various authenticator products that are available on your mobile phone. So I had to get that public service announcement in. Thanks. And pitch. NIST work.
Well, just to pull on one thread you mentioned, which is older legacy equipment. Obviously, equipment that's end of life and vulnerabilities can't be patched anymore. That's a problem. But beyond that, should providers be thinking about older equipment on their networks any differently, or are there special steps they should take? And that's open to anybody who has thoughts.
I'm happy to start from a practical perspective, and I think there's a lot of work in the kind of operational technology space that's relevant here as well. When you really do have systems that you can't replace, you can't update, you can't patch, the idea of what kind of compensating controls can we wrap around those assets. And this goes back to the very beginning of understanding that you have these assets and understanding that there's potentially an issue here. So that just highlights how critically important that kind of inventory identify piece of the puzzle is. But that's kind of how from where I sit, have seen kind of the compensating security controls and technical capabilities around those, but I'm sure others have more relevant kind of ideas around the kind of telecom space.
Yeah, we get that question a lot, especially from small and mid-size carriers, and it really goes back to the asset, identifying it so you know which ones can be patched and which ones can't. And then also, for those that you can't or you can't upgrade, well, what do you do about it? And are there compensating controls? Are there other mechanisms? Is there some level of segmentation? Is there another level of monitoring that needs to be applied? So it really is dependent upon what is the inventory of assets that you've got, how many of them are legacy that need special attention. But it also goes back to this whole notion of, again, making it easy for small and mids to figure out how to do it so that, again, they're not trying to understand the plethora of ZTA, but they've got specific things that they should be doing in those cases where, again, they have legacy equipment versus, more modern equipment that can easily be upgraded.
And this is where the risk-based assessment becomes really important. My academic colleagues who have not been in business, they're like, oh, companies are stupid. They're not spending more than all of their money on protecting themselves. And I'm kind of like, well, that's kind of the point. There would be no business. So that's a kind of a denial of service attack. So understanding what's in your network and understanding what the risks are to having that in your network. So yeah, it's end of life. I have to rip it out. So the question that Charles asked this morning, literally last week, I didn't upgrade my router. Well, actually, I did upgrade my router. I ripped it out and put in brand new ones. My 10-year-old router, I got the no more firmware updates for you. How many people even knew that they needed to update the firmware on their, this is my residential router, So what's the risk? And then, when is the time to, frankly, you are going to have to spend the money. But that's, again, why it's your C-suite being involved, because you need to convince the CFO that at that point, you need to convince yourself that the risk is more than not doing anything. Because sometimes the rational answer is, we need to wait on that and focus on this other very high-risk area that needs remediation.
So I think we're all in agreement that vulnerability patching is fundamental cyber hygiene. And if that's the case, then end-of-life equipment needs to be replaced. Otherwise, you're going to have this technical debt where you carry forward these vulnerabilities that will remain unpatched for eternity. So replace that equipment. One other perspective, too, is specifically on mobile. 3GPP has specified each generation of mobile to be more secure than the previous generation. 4G is more secure than 3G. 5G is more secure than 4G, and we are correctly anticipating 6G will be more secure than 5G. This is what I have coined the G is greater than G minus 1 rule. So it is important, too, that when we also consider upgrading our legacy equipment and removing end-of-life equipment, it's important to upgrade from 4G to 5G now.
So my jumping there, which you couldn't see in the studio audience or the remote audience, 5G is more secure than 4G if you turn on the secure options.
Yes, and that's where FCC CISRIC comes in.
That's right.
Because we have written some excellent reports on which security options should be enabled in U.S. operator networks, and these were written in collaboration with the U.S. operators.
And part of the work we've done at NIST is taking those optional features and documenting how you turn them on and what it looks like if you do and why it's important. So some of the 5G cybersecurity work coming out of NIST is really trying to give that practical, okay, here's the threat I'm trying to address, and here's how this feature that the standards include can help me solve that. And I can ask my vendor to aid me in turning that on.
But just a foot stomp on what Jeff just said, which is it's really important because when I take that to small and mid-sized carriers and say, here's what is recommended, here's what came out of CISRIC, here's what's coming out of NIST, it's not a discussion. They just, it's a roadmap for them to implement. And I think that's really, really valuable. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of that work because it does, it's not only the credibility that NIST and CISRIC have, but it also are specific recommendations that are digestible and they know exactly what knobs to turn.
Well, and for those who are watching who don't know what CISRIC is, it's the Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council, which we appreciate all the plugs. It's run out of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau here at the FCC and has just been rechartered for the next 2 years with some really good national security focused working groups. So we've got about 10 or 15 minutes left, and I just want to move on to a couple of questions about the threat landscape that Charles talked about in the first session. the first one is, how concerned should the small and mid-size providers be about the threat from cell typhoon, other advanced persistent threats, other foreign adversary threats? What can they do? Where can they go to seek assistance? Who should they be talking to get the information they need about the threat and figure out what steps they need to take?
Be very afraid. But in all seriousness, and especially if people remotely missed Dr. Clancy's introduction, once this is posted, go review it. Because yes, today most of the threat actors are criminal gangs. And as he alluded to towards the end, many of those criminal gangs are nation-state actors. I happened to be in Japan right after North Korea attacked the Japanese crypto industry and walked away with $1.5 billion. And putting that in perspective, that's 10 nuclear warheads that can reach Japan. It's one that can reach the United States. So this is not just a regional issue. It's a global issue. Does that mean, oh my goodness, I'm going up against a nation-state actor, I can't do anything? Well, the answer is a lot of it's because there are people who've left the doors and windows open. And there is truth to the, if your door's locked, they'll walk down the street. And this is why we have NIST, we have CTIA, we have the vendors, and we have things like ComISAC, where we, as a community, exchange what's going on, the situational awareness, and best practices. It's not just, oh my goodness, someone else has been attacked. It's, oh hey, we saw this attack, and by implementing the zero trust stuff, it literally bounced off us. So we're seeing the attack, which is going to be important to people, but also knowing that some of these mitigations actually work.
Yeah, I'd add to what Eric just said that the DHS ComISAC has been invaluable to small and mid-sized carriers because they actually then get visibility to the broader audience and everything that happens operationally within the ComISAC. Also, we spend a lot of time with small and mid-sized carriers to help them understand that if something happens, call the FBI. Because law enforcement's there to help you, and they can certainly assist. But then also to contact the relevant trade association, because I get contacted through the Cybersecurity Working Group that CTIA has sponsored since 2012. From many of our members with regards to, what they're seeing, how they're seeing it, what they should be thinking about doing. And we try to support them as much as we can, especially in terms of resources that they should leverage within government. But indeed, it's really a matter of acknowledging the fact that they are a target, that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And being able to then pull on the resources based upon the plan that says, okay, I need to go to the ComISAC, DHS, I need to go to contact the FBI, I need to pull in help from the trade association, whatever those resources are, but to be, willing to pull those resources and to engage, because sometimes when you're in the middle of a crisis, it's hard to figure out, well, okay, what are all the things that need to be done? But it's to leverage those resources as much as possible.
All right, so relatedly, and the answer may be similar here, but one of the other things that Charles talked about was the threat of ransomware attacks, which can be devastating for providers. It can expose customer information. It can cause outages. So how should providers be thinking about this risk, and are there any specific steps they should take to prepare for it?
So I get that question a lot, especially given what happened with one of our mid-sized carriers not too long ago. And I don't know how to say this any more plainly, but is backup, backup, backup. And the importance of having the ability to recover, the ability to, in some sense, reboot the system to a previous state and not take a week to do it, is absolutely critical, and that's got to be part of the plan. And then, if you're a victim of ransomware, leverage the resources. Don't immediately think about, okay, how much cryptocurrency do I need to go find to pay the ransom? That's not always the right answer. And again, it's really having that plan. That plan needs to address the risk of ransomware. But the most fundamental thing that, and again, small and mid-sized carriers, especially the very small, don't necessarily think about backups. But that's the most critical aspect of that, so that you're not necessarily beholden to, getting your system back online. If data has been compromised, that's a different problem, and that's something that needs to be addressed separately. But typically, from what we've seen, it's literally the ability to operate that gets held ransom.
And I think to add to the three-step process of backup is take some of those backups offline and make sure you test those backups so that we know that, hey, the ransomware hasn't impacted your backups as well. And we know we have that muscle, we know how to exercise restoring from those.
You were looking over my shoulder.
Yeah, I think we've heard some common themes throughout this that are really important and foundational to what the Tier 2 and Tier 3 operators can be doing. Make sure you use trusted vendors, remediate your vulnerabilities, harden your systems, replace legacy technologies and systems, and take a zero-trust architecture mindset so that you're also defending against the evolving internal threats.
The one thing I'd add to what Scott just said is leverage the resources that are available to small and mids. From NIST, from the trade associations like CTIA, and from CISRIC. Again, I'm a big fan, and I think some of the best work that's ever been done when it comes to, securing the telecom networks in the United States are in the CISRIC documents. And I often suggest to my members to always leverage the trade association, because we're here to help in terms of supporting their needs, because again, they're very different from the big guys. The big players, they've got the resources, they've got, the availability of technology to leverage when it comes to these kinds of threats. And so we spend a lot of time working with the small and mids, and it's just encouraging them to do that is really, part of the solution to getting them to the point where, again, they can try to secure everything that's within their business. The challenges that we do run into are, again, we're missing ZTA for dummies, and we're also, help them address the points that Jeff raised with regards to how to deal with ransomware, because increasingly they're being targeted.
I think also kind of pulling on a theme that we've gone back to is, as these smaller operators and telcos are looking to transition to more modern or newer generations of these technologies, understand that there is some kind of there is a shift in the underpinning capabilities that they require, and with that comes a shift in the skill sets you need as part of your organization to manage these technologies. So, and that is kind of the foundations of doing cybersecurity. If you can't understand how the Kubernetes-based containerization core network you're planning to operate is going to operate, it's going to be a lot harder to secure that system. So make sure that as you're transitioning and as you're evolving, that your staffing and your skill sets are up to speed.
So all of the above, and taking it up a level, I also want to thank the chair for putting together a focus on national security now in the FCC. And I think this event here is an example of that direction really coming to fruition. And part of that is pre-breach. And as you're kind of hearing, it's like, you will be breached or you have been breached and you don't know it yet. Now's a good time to be talking with the folks like in the cybersecurity division here. Now is the time, and they're very, very happy to do this. Your local FBI field office, they're more than happy to come visit, especially, again, for your C-suites. It gives them a little bit of comfort. Back when the FBI first got into cyber, they were kind of notorious for saying, oh, and while we were here, we found this other thing, you're bad, they don't do that anymore. They've realized really focus on helping the victim. There have been 4 executive orders across 4 different administrations making it very clear. You only need to call the FBI. Go back 15 years, you called, it was before, around DHS. You call them and they'd say, oh, great, we can help you with this, but, you got to call them, and you had to tell them everything all over again, and like, oh, but you need something else, you got to go call them. Now it's very clear. You call the FBI, they will take care of all of that for you. They see a lot of stuff going on, not just in the telecommunications field, but across, the entire nation. So these are all resources that you should not be afraid to call. Again, beforehand, I totally get you might not want to call the FCC if you've got a problem. Of course, you will all follow the reporting requirements that you have. But again, establishing those relationships now before you have to break the glass. That's what I would really encourage the carriers to do.
Thanks. And just to echo that, we also encourage people to call the FBI. There are reporting requirements, but related to outages, loss of CPNI, but we also have an operations center here at the FCC, which is available 24/7 to take calls from carriers and help them through these issues and refer them as needed. So on that note, thanks very much for the excellent discussion. We really appreciate it. Hope it was helpful for everyone listening. And please join me, those in the room, in thanking our excellent panelists.
Great. Thank you all again so much for a really rich, robust discussion. I really loved all the mutual shout-outs. So as we all heard, there are a lot of available and scalable practices that can help mitigate those cyber risks we talked about first this morning. And we appreciate the perspectives you all shared with us that will help enable providers of all sizes to develop and advance an actionable plan that works for them. So we'll take another short break now before our final session, where we'll explore how to prepare to respond to a cyber attack. That will begin at 12:45, and again, restrooms are located just outside the doors here. Welcome back, everyone. If folks in the room could please be seated, we will get started shortly. Thanks so much. I'd like to introduce now Megan Brown and Ray Minifield. Megan is a partner at Wiley Ryan and co-chair of the Privacy, Cyber, and Data Governance practice there. And Ray is director of the Cyber Defense practice at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Together, they've helped many of their clients prepare for and respond to cybersecurity incidents and build effective cyber response strategies. So over to you.
Well, thank you so much for having us, and I'm told our slides will pop up. I don't know if I need to hit the first button to advance them. But I'm Megan Brown. I run the privacy and cyber team at Wiley Ryan. In that capacity, we've handled a lot of incidents, both nation state, ransomware, cybersecurity compliance, planning, policy work here at the FCC. So really thrilled to be here. Ray, can you give a quick
Yes.
sense of your background?
So Ray Minifield, Director in Cybersecurity in PwC, and we help to respond to a variety of incidents, fraud, nation states, cyber criminals, and just about everything in between.
So the FCC asked us if we could sort of use a ransomware incident as a way to help explain the life cycle of an incident and sort of the things that small and medium-sized telecom companies might want to, excuse me, prepare for. So our agenda really is to kind of have some practical tips throughout the life cycle of an incident, which we've simplified, but hopefully you'll see there's a logical flow to it. To give you just some things to chew on, this is a lot, and if you listened to the previous 2 sessions, I think there's a lot coming at you, and so our goal is not to hit every possible scenario or thing, nor is it to freak you out too much. It's hopefully there's enough in here that will give you threads to pull, and you can start to think about, if you haven't already, refining your approach. We picked a ransomware. I think the FCC wanted ransomware as an example because it focuses on fast decisions and it sort of gives an artificial sometimes quickness to things. But you could confront a vendor issue, right? I know a lot of small and mids. You work with a lot of third-party suppliers. They have issues, and so the playbook here is going to apply to a ransomware event. There'll be slightly different things that we'll talk about, but it could be much broader. So Ray, do you want to sort of?
Yep, and I'll just add on that the life cycle is a framework, and so many incidents never follow the same process. And as you factor in the organizational context, there's going to be a variety of different things. Some things may be happening in parallel. Some things might be completely outside. An OT incident is not going to be the same as a back office incident. And so just you keep this in mind that the framework is there to guide us through some of the major decisions and steps.
Yeah, and I think you'll see, this is a busy slide to sort of show you the life cycle or the path in somewhat of a linear fashion. These incidents are often not linear, but it gives us at least a framing device to walk through the big chunks of activities and considerations. In case it's not obvious, I'm not the technical person, Ray is the technical person, so he'll be talking a lot about sort of the operational things and tactics. I'll be layering in kind of the regulatory, legal risk decisions and kind of what we've seen, both of us have seen work and not work. A lot of it will pick up on themes from the previous panel about best practices and readiness, because this is taken at least in part from the NIST cybersecurity framework that was mentioned before. There's a lot of guidance out there in the world we'll touch on about incident response that comes from the good work that NIST has been doing.
Yep,
So,
I'll just add on that you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall down to the level of your system. So the processes that you have, the plans that are in place, how tested are those plans, where the coordination happens, is that organizational wide, all of that matters when you're responding to an incident, as we'll get into in some of the subsequent slides.
Yeah. So with that, we're just going to dive in, and just structurally, this is the big picture. We're going to take this apart by phase and sort of use each phase as a construct, and that'll help us talk about the roles, decision makers. You heard a lot of discussion on the last panel about engaging the C-suite, and I think you'll hear themes throughout this that show how the different pieces of preparedness, compliance, the best practices that they talked about feed into this, and it really ends up being what I think we hope is a virtuous cycle of. And I think NIST does a nice job having the circle that shows how it feeds back on itself. But that's kind of the structure that we're going to follow for the next hour.
Okay, and so oftentimes this is the start of an incident, and many times an organization might have one indication or two. Maybe they have a ransomware note that they're aware of. That may be one piece of it, but their threat actor may have done a variety of things that need to be discovered. And so the focus for the technical response is going to be to identify all of that and then feed that into the overall process. So management might have one response. Your executives are going to be concerned about one thing. Your crisis communications team, they're going to be focused on a different aspect. If there's organizational response, that's another aspect. The business units are going to have a completely separate consideration, and understanding the details for the threat actor, the incident are going to be key. So one, how did they gain access? What are the credentials? What is the root cause? What is the initial infection vector? Understanding if there was any reconnaissance, and then piecing all of that together. Also, with ransomware, sometimes there is data that's exfiltrated as well. So was data exfiltrated, and what data was exfiltrated? And oftentimes, what notifies individuals that it is a ransomware incident is that the deployment of ransomware, the locking of systems, and the operational aspects. So understanding all of those components is the responsibility of the technical team. And many of the incidents, they may start off as maybe small in scope, but understanding, is this a larger incident? Has this reached into the operational systems? Has this reached into the OT environment? Understanding the full extent, and then being able to feed that up, and going back to your plan. What is the criticality of this incident, and who needs to be brought in? Which business teams need to be brought in, whether that's your technical teams, your operational teams, and possibly even some of your customer communications notifications teams.
So at this point, kind of what we've construed as phase 0, right? You've got activity that you may not be aware of, or you may be at the very beginning stages where, say, in the NIST 861 response document, you'd be starting to think about how to escalate, how to triage, how to understand what's happening. Roughly at this time, you hopefully will have already had in place certain key things built into your incident response plan, built into the risk management stuff that we've talked about on the previous panel. Those things will, before you dive in to the technical stuff that Ray would do, for instance, you might hire PwC to help you if you don't have a large, robust incident response team. But before you've gotten there, just to go over some of the key things that I think the FCC and others would think you'd have in place. You've got your incident response plan, and we'll talk about the importance of each of these. You should have an idea of who the key decision makers are, right? A lot of clients, a lot of companies will test these things out so that you have a good understanding in advance of who's going to make the decision to do X, Y, or Z, who's going to hire outside forensic consultants. A lot of companies will have their insurance. If you have cyber insurance, you will have looked at that. You'll understand what your options are, what they cover, how you onboard any outside counsel or forensic advisors, what they'll pay for. And one thing that we have seen and experienced is that early stage, which is right when phase 1 or phase 0 kind of jumps to phase 1, where you're actually starting to activate these things, is the more pre-planning or pre-thinking you can have done, the better position you'll be in. Sometimes forensic vendors, even the most large, sophisticated vendors that you might want to call, it takes a bit for them to onboard you. You have to execute a statement of work. You have to do these things, and that is critical time. So that's one thing that we recommend that may be more in the best practices bucket from earlier, but as you're thinking about, and especially if you're a mid-sized company that doesn't have a 50-person security apparatus, who is the core team? Hopefully your incident response plan addresses this, but if it doesn't, now's the time to think about who is that team, right?
Yeah. I'd also add in, the team that you bring in, are they approved by your insurance? Do you have an outside counsel firm identified? Have they all worked together? Have they done any sort of planning, exercises, or coordination? Is this the first time that they're going to be working together, or is this just a tried and true process? All of those are important in the speed factor of your response, and there's always going to be a speed of recovery versus the depth of the analytics, and there's always that trade-off in incident response.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we've experienced is day one, you may, well, quite frankly, for a long time, you're going to be getting your arms around what actually happened. What you know early is going to change over time. Hopefully, you spin up some resources, and maybe it turns out you don't need them all because the incident didn't unfold in a worst-case scenario kind of way. But you want to be in a position to spin up your inside and outside counsel, your security folks, know who on the board, who in the senior leadership needs to be involved, balanced against sensitivity of the information. You don't want to start emailing the entire organization about a problem before you've got your arms around it. So there's a lot of trade-offs here, and that's why incident response, I think, is challenging. It can be very rewarding at the end of it, but it is very challenging at the outset.
And so, with regards to this first phase, you want an initial understanding of the incident. No understanding is going to be perfect at this phase, and you're going to be operating off of incomplete information. But you, at the same time, as you're balancing that trade of the speed to recovery versus the depth of your analytics and understanding the incident. You don't want to destroy any evidence or any leads that may lead you to the full depth of it. You don't want to wait too long to engage your outside counsel, your crisis communications team, your incident response team if there's a dedicated function. You want to make sure that the right folks are brought in appropriately and that they are brought in according to the plan that you have in place.
So I think a couple other things that Ray and I had discussed in advance about kind of mistakes that could be made and kind of pitfalls to avoid. Ray hit a few of them, allowing evidence to be destroyed or overwritten as your technical teams are trying to do things, right? You might shut down a system too quickly. And in a ransomware situation, there's always a balance, well, often a balance about alerting a threat actor too quickly. And that's why incident response and sort of cyber generally is not, it's not an easy thing for outsiders to come in and sort of second guess, because it's full of these trade-offs, right? You might be working with your vendor and say, you know what, we don't want to tip off the threat actor until we've managed to do a few things, for example. Failing to document your actions and not having a plan to track kind of what your timeline of decisions is. We'll get to notifications and things, but sort of there's a lot of benefit from some early prep work that hopefully may be not needed, but just so you have those sort of structures in place. And, you know, having an idea of how will you communicate with your team if you're not sure that your system is secure, right? An out-of-band communications channel, Signal, WhatsApp, you know, pick your poison, but having the ability to communicate when your own system might be vulnerable. So Ray, do you want to talk a little bit about the technical containment sort of aspect of things?
Absolutely. So containment can take a variety of different, but first it's going to be confirmation. Once you've confirmed the incident, it's deploying your tool set, or utilizing the tools that are currently inside the environment. And containment can be resetting someone's credentials. Containment could be isolation. If this incident has occurred in your back office, perhaps isolating that and making sure that your operational networks are untouched. This could be possibly utilizing machine-level containment on the tools that you have deployed. This could be blocking some sort of traffic at a networking level. It could be developing, many times people will fall back to, I'd say, containment of, well, the machine has ransomware, let's just, take it out and replace it. And while that handles the operational aspects, it actually misses on the root cause analysis. And organizations that do this, sometimes they'll often play whack-a-mole, where, well, you've fixed one machine, but now another machine, the same issue, because you haven't addressed the underlying root cause. And so once you're in the containment phase, there's a joint effort of root cause analysis, so finding the entry point, tracking lateral movement, and understanding any of the data that may have been exfiltrated. All of that has to happen in parallel. This goes back to, it's not a sequential thing, it's a parallel thing based on the specifics of the incident.
Can you talk a little bit about what role you or an equivalent organization would play in a forensic investigation and in the containment phase? Because I think sometimes it's hard to picture who's doing all of these things, right? Like, is your CISO doing it when he's not slept for 3 days and has to do some other stuff as well? But talk a little bit about who actually does this stuff.
Yep, and so you want to have a dedicated technical team who's working on it. So there should be ideally 2 teams. You have your technical team who's specifically focused on getting to that root cause, deploying any of the tools, understanding telemetry in the environment, and putting all of that together. But you also want a leadership team that is helping to coordinate not only organizational response, but also any of the decision points that need to be made, because you don't want, the last thing you want is your CISO, your CIO coming in and saying, why isn't this fixed 5 days ago, or 5 minutes ago, or 5 hours ago? It's counterproductive to the actual analysis, and it actually leads back into that whack-a-mole issue that I was describing.
Can you, and we didn't discuss this in advance, so sorry if this is a bit of a curveball, but you've handled a lot of these incidents. How long should someone expect, perhaps, that a complete forensic investigation might take. You know, you've got your rapid stuff of the containment, and that too might take a while. But sometimes people, I think, don't appreciate how long some of this can take, and the forensic investigation may be unrelated to or not. It may not determine, although it might inform, for example, like a ransom payment decision. So sometimes this is happening very quickly, but sometimes true forensic investigations in a complicated scenario can take a while. Can you shed a little light on the timing?
Absolutely, and Megan with the trick questions, this is fantastic. Specifically, there's three different aspects. So you've got the forensic investigation, you've got understanding the data, and then you've got any of the organizational response that may happen. So the most important piece for the forensic investigation is not only the containment elements, but understanding what data may have been exposed, what data is at risk, and if there is an underlying issue that needs to be addressed before that containment can occur. And so the analysis piece, the containment, that can vary according to the incident, but some incidents it's very quick because say you're utilizing a well-known vulnerability or something of that nature. Others, especially if it's a vulnerability that you're not aware of, those may take, instead of weeks, those may take maybe perhaps a month, perhaps, in between a month and or in between 1 and 2 months, somewhere along those. But the forensic investigation has to get to root cause, what actually led to this incident, and then being able to contain at least initial containment as the analysis progresses.
And how have you seen that sort of shift in a ransom event because of the pressures and the speed potentially that are present?
Yeah, so threat actors don't like to wait, and neither do executives when they are reporting to whatever stakeholders, shareholders they are responsible to. So again, it's where that dual track comes into play. So there are always going to be pressures from external, whether that's possibly regulations that may come into play, executives that have to report financial earnings, are the threat actors themselves demanding financial payment. All of those have to be factored in, but it cannot affect the fidelity of your analysis. Your results have to be able to stand on their own, and more specifically, they have to lead to proper containment so that this doesn't reoccur again.
And I think one takeaway is in a ransom event in particular, but I have found in many incidents, you are making decisions with imperfect information. And you might not have, at the time you have to make a decision for your organization, the final forensic analysis. You might not know root cause with the kind of confidence you would at 60 days when Ray's team has gone through every piece of data that they can get their hands on and they can figure out what happened. You may be making decisions under a lot of pressure without a lot of time. And I've seen the most effective ways of handling that are when the C-suite and the key decision makers understand and accept the imperfections of what they're dealing with. And you can communicate, you can assess risks, and come to decisions informed by both what you have, what you know, and what you don't know. But I think that's something people don't always remember, that, when we're reading about something in the paper a year later, we know a lot. But on day 3, when you've got to make decisions about, do you turn something off, do you pay a ransom, for example, you're making decisions with a lot less information than people would expect.
Agreed. Forensics is an iterative process, and it doesn't actually end until there are no additional threads to pull. So as long as there are additional investigation avenues to pursue, there always may be, the forensics is considered incomplete until that point. So oftentimes you'll see an initial timeline that may be provided, and it's an initial set of facts. It's that initial picture that's provided. It's incomplete, it's just an initial understanding of the event, but that may be incomplete, and I've never seen the initial timeline be accurate and be the final timeline.
Right. I mean, and they're intense and they evolve as a matter of, as the facts unfold, and then you will have to respond to the changing facts. That could affect a variety of issues. And I think if we could go to the next slide, I don't know if I've accidentally shut us down. But the next slide, there we go. Nope, I think I jumped ahead, sorry. I was told it takes a sec. All right. There we go. All right, so Ray has talked about some of the technical limitations and kind of that initial phase of containment, trying to understand what happened. You've gathered some information. That raises some tensions, and this is where if you're in your active incident response, your team is meeting. They could be meeting twice a day early on. You've got your communications people. You've got your in-house counsel. You probably have outside counsel. You have your technical team. Depending on the level of incident and visibility, you might also be outbriefing to the board. But at this point, you're starting to see and experience some of the key tensions that will apply to the organization. You've got choices about containment, forensics, and business continuity, right? So certain, attacks, you may have to make some hard choices about, do I shut down a system, take something offline, and that may itself have a lot of trade-offs about, well, if I do certain things, people are going to notice. My employees will notice if this back office system, or if the billing system is suddenly unavailable, or if the sales team can't do things. So these are the kinds of discussions that a company or an organization will be having about what are the trade-offs, what are the benefits and costs and risks and rewards of making some of these choices. And we've seen some play out in the press, usually after the fact, about decision-making process, right? And it's easy in hindsight to look and say, well, you might have made a different decision. But if you have an apparent ransom event and you don't know whether it has hopped over into your OT environment or vice versa, you may have to make a tough decision. And we've had clients make those decisions to say, we're going to take the money-generating portion of our business offline for a period of time so we can figure out how bad this is. And then hopefully you can restore the money-generating portion of your business very quickly. But those are the choices that you make with your CISO, potentially your outside forensics team. You may at this point also have, brought in other third-party stakeholders. In a ransomware event, one of the big pain points that you will next or already have started to think about is, do you engage with the threat actor? And the FBI is not here, but I know in speaking with them, they don't love the payment of ransom. No one does. They also recognize that sometimes it is a business decision. We can talk about some of those trade-offs, but that is often an early question that has to be grappled with in our particular hypothetical, which is, are you going to engage and how? Luckily, there are plenty of third-party helpers that will assist you with those considerations. And so to pick up on a theme from the previous panel, you don't have to go through this alone. You can call the FBI. You can call your insurer. In fact, you should be calling your insurer, and I often am recommending talking to the FBI. But that's an example of kind of how advanced thinking with your senior leadership. I know of organizations that immediately take a very hardline view. We will never pay a ransom. I know others that are more willing to entertain those outcomes because of the business trade-offs or the risk to data. We wanted to highlight just a few of the legal considerations that at this point or soon in what I think is still phase one of our hypothetical incident. These are just a smattering of them, and of course, I'm not providing legal advice, and I'm not speaking for the FCC. They may have slightly different views on certain triggers, but one big question is, have we had a breach, right? And I think it is often a best practice not to jump to a conclusion that you've had a breach too early, right? You've had an event. There's stuff happening that you are investigating. But the regulatory regimes are very varied in terms of what the triggers are. So that's an early question is, do we have a breach? Is this a real incident? Where does it fit in your criticality assessment, right? Many organizations will have their own severity scale. And if you're sophisticated about that, you'll have started to plug it in, knowing full well the facts may change and it may move wildly from a low sev to a high severity and move around.
Yep, and I'll just add,
Yeah, jump.
Depending on that severity, that should dictate who you bring in. So there's some folk, so engaging with the FBI, for example, I've never seen that to be something that has harmed an incident. Sometimes the FBI has nothing, sometimes they don't want to share, but sometimes they're willing to help and collaborate. It's an additional thread that the investigators can pull, and that ultimately feeds into the decision point. Obviously, as Megan said, you should always engage with your insurer, you should always engage with your auditor. There are certain folks who just engaging with them early on, especially your outside counsel, that's simply going to help to facilitate the process and understand all of the different decision points that you're going to have to make throughout it. It's extremely beneficial for the leadership, collaboration to resolve an incident.
Yeah, and I think we'll touch a little bit more shortly on some of the specific regulatory regimes. Depending on the severity, you may or may not need to be talking to any of those people, but having the ability to triage, to say, this is what we think is happening, to be able to document timelines, decision-making, thought process, figuring out whether you've triggered the internal governance about updating your board or your senior leadership. Hopefully, knowing in advance, but if not, taking action now to assess contractual obligations, third-party obligations that may not immediately spring to mind because they're not codified in some federal regulation. To pick up on the FBI piece, I agree. I haven't seen working with the FBI be detrimental. The FBI, I think, has done a very good job over the past 10 years of emphasizing that it is a partner. There are decisions sometimes you can think about in advance. The FBI will sometimes want to engage in some network monitoring. You might want to have thought about that before you're in a crisis. What are your sensitivities there about providing information to the federal government? So those are conversations that you can have in advance. And I think the previous panel really was right to say a lot of the field offices have really sophisticated cyber teams. They'd be happy to meet with folks. And having some of those relationships in advance, sometimes through counsel, sometimes through your CISO, can be really helpful. You can pick up the phone more quickly and get a hold of agent so-and-so who can understand and give you some of what they know. That's been some of the very helpful things, is when they are able to share and say, this is what we've seen with what appears to be your threat actor, or this is how we've seen something unfold. Very helpful. So those are kind of some of the early things that we put into kind of phase 1, part 2 or 3. And I think now we're going to move to, I think that takes us through phase 1. Now we're moving into phase 2, which we consider kind of investigate and expel. And so, Ray, do you want to kick us off with sort of what's a company thinking about at this phase?
Yep. So phase 1 is understanding that initial set of facts. Phase 2 is a deeper understanding and then stabilization. So depending on the nature of the incident, in this case ransomware, understanding what that root cause is, how the threat actor may have gotten in, understanding and mitigating reentry, whatever that may be, and then tactical monitoring. As we mentioned, the FBI may be able to assist with this, different organizations such as CISA may be able to assist with this. All of that factors into this initial containment and stabilization of operations. Once the stabilization is, once that's been done, also, I do want to mention one thing. You want to also document the stabilization efforts. This not only plays into your overall incident timeline, but this is something that insurers will ask about towards the tail end of the incident. So the sooner you get that and the more rigor you add to that process, the better just throughout the overall life cycle of the incident. And then at this phase, you may begin hardening, you may not. Again, it depends on the nature of the incident and some of the specifics. So once that stabilization's occurred, the deeper understanding continues. You're going to understand, the data, the specific malware variants, and all of the other technical aspects. And then you're going to start on the ransomware considerations. So what are data-specific considerations, and specifically, how do you engage with the threat actor if you choose to engage? Some threat actors may be reputable, some may not be, and you may not want to engage at all. All of these are business decisions that have to be made, and the technical team is responsible for providing the ground level facts that form the basis for these decisions.
Yeah, and I think it's to go back to the 3 buckets that Ray alluded to in the initial investigation phase. You've got sort of the initial triage containment, you've got forensic investigation, and then you may have some data analytics. And those things, I tend to think of them in sort of three kinds of work streams. And in certain instances, they may be vastly differently sized, right? You may know very quickly what data or what files may have been accessed, compromised, stolen. You may not. It may take some time to figure out, was something exfiltrated? If so, what was it? Can we figure that out from, say, the backups that John Marino mentioned in the last session? I think he had in mind network backups for operational resiliency, but data backups are also really important in that analysis of what was taken, because sometimes you may not know on day one what might have been impacted, both from a network side or from a data side. And so sort of this phase 2 of investigate is multifaceted, right? You've got the technical side, which is, do we need to take steps to expel someone who's not supposed to be here, terminate access for someone to make sure they don't come back in? And that can be very complicated and sophisticated. Again, there are outside resources to assist with that. This is not like if you have a small security operation, this is not something that you should always expect your CISO can just do. So there are resources out there. But then while you're investigating, you may be gaining information that informs the decisions you might be making about taking down equipment and starting over from scratch with certain things that might have been affected by the threat actor and the ransom decision. And we decided early we were not going to get into the specifics of ransom negotiations or decision-making for what I hope are obvious reasons, but these kinds of fact-gathering exercises inform all of that. And so you will see the decision-making may change as you get more information, as you get confidence that your backups work, for example, as you start to realize that recovery is within sight, for example. So what else, would you say at this stage, Ray, if anything, should a company sort of just have in mind when they're going through this, perhaps with an outside advisor like you?
So I'd say understanding where your risk thresholds are. So what defines different levels of criticality is absolutely going to be critical. Understanding when something may have gone into your subscriber network from your back office. That's going to trigger a completely different set of notifications down the line, where obviously if it's in your back office, that may be PII, something along those lines. And I think as the previous panel alluded to, once something goes into the subscriber network, it kind of disappears. And so understanding what's there, understanding if it's a customer device, if it's a company device, understanding what services that device provides, all of that factors into the data that may be at risk, and that all feeds into the notification. So I'd say those two pieces are absolutely critical for subscribers.
Yeah, and I think at this stage, some of the considerations from a legal and risk perspective that I think companies would have in mind in our hypothetical ransomware scenario would be, for example, sanctions risks, right? I don't think it's a secret that ransomware attackers, criminal enterprises, nation states who are engaged in this horrible, evil activity are often also on United States sanctions lists. And so one of the things the FBI will remind folks is that if you're going to make a ransom payment, you need to do the utmost diligence to make sure that you're not remitting any kind of compensation to terrorists, designated entities, nation-state threats. And so there is a process for that. There are facilitators that can help you through that. Your lawyers can help you through that. But that is one consideration. And that can be sort of directionally determinative early on. If you know you're dealing with a certain set of actors or who you have confidence, that may narrow your scope of decision-making. But that's a thing that I think the in-house team, the chief financial officer is often involved in these kinds of discussions to make sure that you're aware of those things and mitigating that risk. Again, you may still be working with law enforcement. It might be the FBI. It could be CISA. If you're in a critical infrastructure sector, as almost everyone here is, you may have decided to engage CISA. I appreciated the comment earlier that the FBI is the central focus for a lot of this, but CISA has a lot of very helpful resources. They can help coordinate. If you're, for example, a government contractor, you may have some customer-specific issues that come up, CISA can be a resource for that. But you may be in the process of interacting with law enforcement, and often that's through counsel, to try and keep the security team focused on the security stuff that they're doing. But that will result in additional work streams, additional questions and decisions along the way. Will you be willing to provide the FBI with certain information? Are there protections in place for providing that information, right? This is my plug for the Cyber Information Sharing Act of 2015, that I think it's very important that protections for sharing information with the federal government, in that instance, CISA, stay in place and are robust. But having your lawyers be familiar with those decision processes so they can make an informed choice about, yeah, you know what, we're going to give those indicators of compromise to the FBI because that's going to help. They're going to push those out to the community, and others can then be on notice. Or, no, we're not going to give them a copy of that file or that hard drive because it has customer information in it, and we're not comfortable sharing what someone else might have a privacy interest in. So those are a few of those kinds of considerations that your legal departments may be grappling with. You may be interacting, Ray mentioned, maybe interacting with your insurer. They often have great resources. They either have counsel that they can give you, who may not be very expensive. They will have forensic providers. They will have potentially ransom negotiators. They will have all kinds of resources. So you may be in dialogue with them. They frequently, as Ray mentioned, they want updates, particularly in the ransom context. What's the state of play? What are, there's a dance with them, but it's often, pretty collaborative. Have I missed anything on that?
No, I just want to emphasize again, it is a cross-functional decision at this point, once that initial set of facts is understood, and it's not only inside your organization, but external.
And then I think one other piece, on the screen, there's a bullet for communications, and that covers a lot, right? You've got a variety of stakeholders in any cyber incident, but also in ransomware, and sometimes in particular. What is the support you have, and how are you approaching communicating internally, externally, with the government? It's vital that information communicated be accurate, and that is always a challenge when, as Ray confirmed, like, the facts are changing. It's not, what you know on day 3 may not be what you know on day 7. So, there's a balance in when you're communicating, how you're communicating, what level of detail you're communicating, and are you going to be able to communicate at a time and manner of your choosing? In a ransom situation, the threats may include imminent public disclosure of something that it would be very harmful to you or third parties. I think there was a fairly high-profile incident just over the past week or so that affected schools because an infrastructure provider, and so you could see kind of that play out in remarkable detail, I thought, in real time. But those are the kinds of considerations, and we are frequently advising folks to, as part of your incident response plan, before you're having a very bad day, think about, do you want to have some draft statements, right? Do you already work with a PR firm who could provide you some? I tend to like cyber-specific crisis comms folks, but what preparation work could you do to have your desk statement, your holding statement, right? Who makes a decision about a company-wide email that says X system is offline? And what are you going to say about that, right? Lots of considerations come into play here. If you're a public company, we can talk a little bit about the Securities and Exchange Commission obligations regarding public disclosures of material cybersecurity events and the additional challenge that poses. Because especially if you're in a ransomware situation, you might have your hand forced by external requirements or pressures or public release of information before you were ready for it or before you've had time to make good decisions. So any thoughts from you on the communication side?
Specific collaboration with the individuals who are familiar with that, whether that's your auditors, whether that is your external counsel, whether that is any of your liaisons with regulators, government, all of that is going to be critical, and that's going to be what determines effective response versus ineffective response.
And I would just say, you'll see lots of events that get, coverage in the press or congressional oversight. It's very easy to 6 months out, a year later, criticize or be skeptical of how an organization handled something. We can all have our opinions about that, but in the moment when you're trying to make decisions with imperfect information, this is why talking with your stakeholders, getting information, sometimes collaborating with your regulator or the FBI, Public Safety Bureau. There's lots of ways to inform those decisions and those communications choices that you'll have to make depending on how your incident unfolds. So I think we are now moving into phase 3 of our timeline here, which is sort of mitigation and recovery, which is also super important and can take a long time. So Ray, do you want to give us some thoughts here?
Yep, so recovery is a little bit more than just turning the backup systems on. You never want to just turn, despite whatever your subscribers are, your system, like your CEO says, just no. Understanding, are your backups in play for this incident? Do you have good backups? What's the process for actually restoring from those backups? Has that been tested? What's your time to recovery? What are your primary metrics for defining the outages that backup would cause? Also, is this going to be, with your normal patch cycle? Is this going to be out of your normal patch cycle? What's the determination for making that justification? All of that factors into play on the restoration and the backups, and that's outside of the fact that is this your back office environment, or is this on your subscriber, your core, maybe your voice network? Is this somewhere along? The timetables and the collaboration across different operational teams and business teams may be completely different. That's in addition to the system hardening, so that once the backups are restored, that the incident, whatever may have caused it, does not occur again, and that you're not going through the same process again. Also, one of the things, when one incident's there, it's sometimes indicative of other incidents. So have you looked for related or tangential items? Have you done have you expanded your investigation, and have you fed all of those facts forward? So you never want to say our investigation's complete, we're now moving into this phase of system recovery, and then going back into the investigation, because that not only complicates some of your timelines, but your insurer will start asking some questions that you may not want to answer.
Yeah, it can be tough to scope investigations and forensic work. You might have limited resources, and so if you're making decisions about where to look, what to look for, you want to, be talking to the forensics experts and making, reasonable choices that you can explain about where you looked and why. But I think the goal, especially in a ransomware, if you've got an inkling of how they got in or what the method of access is, making decisions about how we're going to, mitigate the risk of re-victimization, right? You have a lot of double extortion that's going on, very frustrating. And have you asked good, third-party folks to validate that, like, okay, given what we know about the way the threat actor did what they did or where they moved, have we taken the right steps to reduce the risk of re-victimization, which I think is always it's hard because you can never give 100% certainty, right?
So you can't give certainty, but at the same time, you're also responsible for communicating, whether that's to whatever regulatory obligations you adhere to, or whether that's to your customers and your suppliers, whatever is in the contractual agreement. So there has to be a balance between you're operating off of incomplete information, but at the same time, you're communicating the facts that you know, and as they evolve on a predetermined basis, as determined by your management, your outside and inside counsel, and your communications team.
And one thing that I think, your outside vendors, or if you have a robust inside team, communicating those trade-offs to leadership, I think is really important, because you may have senior leadership who are not experts in your radio access network or the trade-offs of how you might change something. So being able to explain, here's the trade-offs, here's the risk we're trying to mitigate, here's the cost, here's the benefit. I think that's a really important function, because you've got the security people who are going to be deeply expert in their area, but it may not always be easy to communicate to the senior leadership team what the trade-offs are, what the necessities are of a particular investment or a particular choice. Because I think that's one of the challenges, I've seen and experienced is you just have to make choices along the way. And, senior leadership is used to making risk-informed choices. That's what they do. But it's how you get them the right information so they can make an informed choice about the trade-offs for the organization.
That's in addition to the communication unknowns that may happen, whether that's an employee saying, I can't access my systems, and that gets reported by, a local newspaper, or whether that is, a bombshell report coming out that, a variety of companies or a new wave of attacks have occurred, and your organization may be a part of it.
Right, and I think one thing the panel before us did a very nice job of, so I'll echo them, is pointing to some of the FCC and CISA documents. There's FCC best practices, there's resources out there, maybe not as technical as how are you going to remediate and get this APT out of this portion of your network, but I do think there were a lot of good materials put together post-Salt Typhoon or sort of in the wake of those discussions that are out there, that are resources that if you're a smaller or mid-sized company, you should avail yourself of. There's also third parties who can come in and assist with security assessments and really kick the tires on, are you doing the right things to mitigate and to harden post or mid-incident? A couple of things at this point as well. You've got now some reporting considerations. In our fictional ransomware lifecycle, you're now, I won't speculate how far into it you are, but you're in our phase 3. So you're thinking about, do I have enough to understand and make decisions about my various reporting obligations, of which there are many. So you've got sector-specific obligations. The FCC's CP&I rules are somewhat complex, but they deal with customer information that you have as a carrier as a result of your relationship with them. So you've got to be thinking about the timelines and the triggers for that in that section 64, I think, of the CFR will lay that out, and that's a very specific, sector-specific obligation. You've got outage reporting at the FCC. If you are an operator and a ransomware event has taken down a piece of your operational network that has impacted service availability, you're going to want to check those rules. Hopefully you've checked them before. Maybe that's something you can do this weekend, is dust those off and see, how do I think they apply to my services, and do I have a robust notification system internally? I'm confident most of the folks on this call will, that your ops team knows who to call when something happens, and the FCC is regularly dealing with outage reports, but that is one to always keep in mind. I can never have a telecom-specific audience without mentioning Team Telecom. There are many folks in the telecom space who have network security agreements or other obligations as a condition of their FCC license that have reporting obligations. Those reporting obligations are usually a little different than what the federal regulatory obligations are, so you'll want to make sure that the team who knows that is engaged, right? So that when you're off doing your remediation and you're doing your data analysis, someone in the room knows, hey, we have to check these other 5 things, right? That hopefully it's baked into your incident response plan or an appendix to that. You've got a whole bunch, the slides went away. Oh, there we go. So in addition to those, you've got an array of potential state obligations. If, say, billing records were obtained or something that would, you might have human resources records that were, for your employees. You'll have to think about the state data breach obligations, of which there are more than 50, unfortunately. And so you'll have to think about that. They tend to have a longer time horizon than the CP&I rules, for example. But you're now sort of seeing this overlapping set of things and questions you have to ask yourself. Coming soon, well, maybe not soon, but coming at some point, new rules from the DHS CISA to implement a federal law passed in 2022 that will require incident reporting by critical infrastructure. As drafted and proposed, they are very broad and I think would have a fairly broad reach within the telecom space. That is a 72-hour reporting obligation. There is another 72-hour reporting obligation if you are a defense contractor. Some of the telecom folks are, and so that's a trigger with its own special triggers. So this is just a flavor of the many things that the council will be asking and working with your data team to figure out, do we know enough to make a determination, or under some of the regulatory regimes, if you are expected to report potential access to information, have you hit those triggers? And so that's why it's important that everyone be working together as forensic investigation unfolds. The right people are learning the critical information in order to make those kind of judgment calls. I think at this point also, and I know I'm lingering here, but I think we were running ahead of schedule, so that's okay. You may also be dealing with the FBI. Again, they may have told you, hey, go make a report to IC3 on the portal, so maybe you've done that. You might be getting some follow-up inquiries from the government if you've made customer notifications, or if you did make a notification to the Department of Defense, you might be getting follow-up from them. So you can see there's a cadence of it evolves and it can expand. You may also have a series of contractual obligations that to third parties or vendors when you're aware of certain kinds of incidents. Those terms tend to differ widely, so hopefully you have a handle on them beforehand, but if not, in phase 3, you're probably getting a handle on them. Some are very short. So that's kind of, a lot of the considerations that we would think are applying at phase 3. So I think we can move to phase 4, which is recover and stabilize and business restoration activities. And again, before Ray jumps in, this all kind of is very consistent with the NIST cybersecurity framework and the incident response guidelines that NIST has put out. So it's these all feed into each other. Recover and stabilize sort of extends out as well.
Pardon me. So at this stage, the response piece isn't over, but the urgent piece of it has moved on. So now you're moving from, okay, we need to understand the facts, we need to do containment, to, all right, now we understand, maybe we have containment and we're performing formal eviction, maybe we're executing on our eviction plan, maybe it's additional hardening steps that may address root cause. All of these are factoring into usually what's the longer end of the response process of where you're collaborating with your engineers, where you're collaborating with IT, where you're collaborating with your operations team to get all of that implemented and underway. At the same time, this should also feed into your modernization roadmap. So whether that's your auditors, whether that's your insurers, they're always going to ask, okay, what have you done to prevent this in the future? What have you done to stop the could factor? There's a variety of different ways that individual stakeholders will phrase that question, but it should all factor in that, yes, this may have occurred, but we understood it, this is what happened, and this is how we are mitigating this moving forward.
And you may be wondering, where in the timeline have we made a payment? Or where have we not made a payment and had that? We're kind of leaving that a little unaddressed, because I'm personally of the view companies have to make that decision. They are well within their rights to do that if that's what is necessary for them. We can have an offline conversation about the policy there. We can also discuss the trade-offs and kind of the negotiation and the thought process, the decision tree. But I think for this slide, it kind of illustrates eviction planning could be happening earlier. You might not need to do eviction planning because you've made a payment and you've gotten decryption keys back. You probably still will do eviction planning, though, because you're never going to trust the bad guys that they've left.
Yeah, someone who broke into your systems may not be the most trustworthy individual.
Yeah, and there has been, like I mentioned, double extortion, and even after payment, there are no guarantees, far from it. But this illustrates kind of the fluidity of the timeline here, that you could be doing. That could happen much more rapidly. It could be at the back end, but this kind of, ideally, the pace of things has calmed at this point, hopefully phase 4. Maybe folks are getting a little more sleep, and the call cadence has decreased to every other day instead of every day. Ray talked about some of the technical and operational things that you would be doing. It might feed into much longer-term planning depending on the severity of the incident or what your forensics teams learned about vulnerabilities, about system upgrades. There's lots of things that you may now go, whoa, like we have to make some serious long-term investments that can't happen on day 10, right? They might take a year, 2 years to get to the end state that you want to be after you've sort of processed what's going on. There also, at this point in our phase 4, you will still be updating your board. You will still be potentially dealing with external stakeholders. It may or may not have become public, and if it has become public, there's a whole separate set of things you'll be dealing with about communication strategy and inquiries from the press, customers, third parties, that are challenging. So with that, I think we move to our fictional phase 5, remediate and transform.
Yep, and so if the eviction plan has not been executed, you'd want to execute it at this stage. Again, that just simply depends on the specifics of the incident. And then implementing the modernization. So whatever that residual risk is that Megan alluded to, it has to be considered. You're moving away, you're well past the crisis piece at this point, and you're like, how do we address that residual risk? How do we ensure that it does not happen again? And how do we plan to address it? What's the timeline that it's addressed on? And does this all factor into our communications? All of that, larger decisions, but at a planning, from a technical response piece, it has to be done, and those facts have to be fed forward. And then, most importantly, the forensic report on the incident and the lessons learned. The forensic report, oftentimes there'll be a summary, there'll be a detailed report. Different audiences may request different versions, different audiences may receive different versions, but it has to be factual, defensible, and properly articulate the timeline of the incident.
And one question that will arise at this point, which reminds me, I should have said at the outset, at phase 1, when you are kicking things off, a key critical decision will be, how to engage counsel and whether you're going to proceed under privilege, what kinds of things will you be protecting. This question will come up also at the back end when it comes to any reporting. It's going to also apply to factual statements that you're going to be making, which of course are non-privileged. So just to give you a sense of, it's a fluid kind of thing with a lot of different considerations. But when you're at this phase, sort of you're thinking now, what tail is on this event, right? Is there going to be regulatory oversight? Are there going to be questions from stakeholders? That's where having a really robust technical response that you can explain to stakeholders is really vital. I've seen clients do a very, very effective job by having a robust technical explanation that they can provide to a regulator, that they can provide to a stakeholder, that says, here's what happened, here's what we did, here are the impacts, and here's why we are confident it's not going to happen again, or that we have addressed the situation. So that's kind of in this phase, which is our last phase, kind of these are the sort of, I don't want to call it wrap up, because I think NIST cybersecurity framework thinks of this as a constant virtuous cycle, but ideally you'll do an after action report or a hot wash or whatever your consultant's going to want to call it to do some lessons learned, to figure out what can we do better next time, what gaps did we have. And that's part of why some of that is properly underprivileged, so that people can be candid and people can share information about what they wanted to do. So sort of in closing, I think the takeaway from, I think we would like for folks to have is, there's a lot of resources. You are not in this alone. It can be very overwhelming. You do not have to digest and resolve every single issue that has been talked about today. You could do a lot in a short period of time to dust off your incident response plan, create one if you don't have it. There's resources to do that. Do, for example, maybe a small tabletop exercise with your senior leadership team to say, let's say we're having a really bad day and X has happened, and we've done these for clients, you do them. Yep. You can make it real specific, you can make it real general, but practice, get comfortable with your decision cadence, who's doing what, especially on a very short time frame. Is your CEO going to be the person who's making the ransom decision? Probably. Is your CFO going to do that? Being prepared in advance will make the day of and the week and month of a lot more achievable with a lot lower stress if you've thought about it in advance. So kind of those are my closing thoughts. Anything you'd like to add?
I'd say it's disciplined speed that you want to achieve. That is through a detailed plan, that is through practicing that plan, that is through understanding who is going to make the decisions and being able to piece all of it together, the coordination aspect. All of that leads into disciplined speed on your response, which is the most critical element, not only for your business operations, but for the sanity of your technical individuals.
And your lawyers. They'll be tired too. So our last slide is just a couple of resources, but I hope you took notes on the panel before us. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework is great. They have tools online. NIST has an array of publications. I point you to 861, special publication 861, which is incident response focused. All the CISA documents that were mentioned before, but also like the resources that are available from your insurer, from the FCC. I know the Public Safety Bureau folks are happy, would love to interact with you if you have questions. So don't feel like you have to just sort of figure this all out on your own. The COM-ISAC that John Marino mentioned and your trade associations are invaluable for advanced planning. So I think that's what we had to say. So thank you for having us, FCC.
Thank you.
Right on time.
Thanks so much, Ray and Megan, for that super helpful presentation to equip folks and really know what to think through and take actionable steps to prepare to respond to a cyber incident. That concludes our planned sessions for today, and I'll turn it back over to Deputy Bureau Chief Austin Randazzo to provide some closing remarks.
Thank you so much. As we conclude today's workshop, I'd like to thank all of our panelists and presenters for their participation today and for the immensely valuable information that they've shared with us. We've heard today about the ever-present threats that are out there that can do real harm to communications networks if folks are not prepared. But we've also heard from experts that have showed us ways that providers can take action to make sure that those risks are being mitigated and that folks can respond effectively when an attack does happen. I think the one clear takeaway from today is that no matter the size or the sophistication of your organization, there are resources out there that can help you make your organization more secure and be prepared if an event like this happens. Make sure that you are, if you're kind of getting into this for the first time, to take a look at some of those resources this afternoon. Look at what are some of the things you should be doing to put a plan together, to start working on planning for an internal exercise so that you can make those decisions about who will be on top of what if the worst day of your organization happens. And if you haven't done so, maybe print out your plan so that if your systems are encrypted, you can still have it and reference it going forward. You know, just little thoughts like that can go a long way in making sure that if you are the victim of an attack, that you can recover quickly. So please think about not just the colleagues in your own organization, think about your customers who are depending on you to keep the service running, and think about all the public safety officials out there that rely on effective 911 calling, effective delivery of emergency alerts, so that your system can be there during a big emergency and that a cyber attack won't bring it down. I'd like to, again, thank all the panelists today, and I'd like to thank all of the staff at the FCC that has helped put this event together. In particular, thank you to Zoe Lee and George Weber, who have done incredible work in making sure this event, both today and the event yesterday for cybersecurity, have gone smoothly. And of course, thank you to all you in the room today and online who are watching this presentation. So have a great day, everyone, and please think about your network and what you can do to make it more secure. Thank you.